that there is no place for violence whatsoever in our constitutional system of government, neither on the right nor on the left. I want to tell the story of Ruby Freeman. Thanks to the January 6th Committee, many Americans know her story. A 62-year-old grandmother in Fulton County, Georgia, she and her daughter Shay Moss are two of the hundreds of thousands of Americans who worked the polls on Election Day 2020. Soon after Election Day, they found themselves at the center of the big lie when presidential counsel Rudy Giuliani promoted a viral video that Giuliani claimed showed Miss Freeman and Miss Moss counting illegal ballots. In reality, Giuliani's claim was false. The only thing Miss Freeman and Miss Moss were guilty of was performing their civic duty diligently, faithfully, legally. The Republican-led Georgia Secretary of State's office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation immediately refuted Rudy Giuliani's lie, but the damage had already been done. For months, the former president's allies and their right-wing media echo chamber relentlessly slandered Miss Freeman and her daughter. They received hundreds of threatening, racist message and phone calls. Miss Freeman was repeatedly harassed and threatened at her home, which she fled shortly before January 6th after the FBI warned her that they could no longer protect her. Miss Moss left her job at the Fulton County Registration and Elections Department, where she'd proudly served for nearly a decade. And just last week, court documents indicated that Miss Freeman and Miss Moss's names were written on a pad of paper labeled Death List, which was found in the home of a member of the Oath Keepers, who's charged with seditious conspiracy in connection with the January 6th attack. Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss are not alone. Despite administering what the former president's own administration called, quote, the most secure election in American history, election workers throughout the country of both political parties, both, have been forced to take extraordinary steps to protect themselves and their families. Many of these election workers have spent their own money installing elaborate home security systems. Others, like one county clerk in Colorado, have begun to wear a bulletproof vest to work. Over the past several months, my office has heard from individual election workers who shared their stories of violent threats. Many of them have submitted statements for our hearing. These threats are taking a disastrous toll on our democracy. According to a recent survey, roughly 1 in 5 election officials plans on leaving their job ahead of the next presidential election. This mass exodus coincides with an ongoing organized effort by big lie promoters to secure jobs administering elections across our country. We saw it last night in the Republican primary in Arizona. Our democracy cannot survive if we allow harassment and intimidation of election officials to become the new norm. As we look ahead to this year's election, fewer than 100 days away, I hope we learn the lessons from the last election. The former president's plot to overturn the election wreaked havoc on America. We saw that personally here in the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Public servants like Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss are living with the consequences of this big lie every day of their lives. I look forward to learning more about the steps the Justice Department and CISA are taking to protect election officials in the months leading up to this election. And I hope every member of this committee will join me in condemning the threats that those officials continue to face. With that, I turn to Ranking Member Grassley for his opening.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Durbin. Our hearing today is on threats against election workers. Threats of violence are never acceptable. Any threat of violence. Violence is a very major problem in America today, with rates of violent crime skyrocketing across the country. Not since the 1990s have we seen these levels of murder, assault, carjacking, robbery, attacks on police, and other violent crimes. The start of this violent crime wave began in 2020 as police nationwide were pulled off the streets. A study from the Council of Criminal Justice showed that murders in major cities in 2021 were 44% more than in 2019. So far this year, Major cities of Baltimore, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and New York City are already worse than in 2021. The baseline is rising. Higher rates of violent crime are becoming the new norm. Some of the main causes of this rise in violent crime are anti-police rhetoric, depolicing efforts, progressive prosecution, bail reform, defund the police movements. We talk about the crisis faced by law enforcement officers last week in this very committee in our hearing about attacks on police. This crisis in policing is happening at the same time that progressive prosecutors refuse to hold violent criminals accountable for their crimes. Witness after witness in this committee has told us that bail reform helps to release violent criminals who then can go commit more crimes. We all heard about the horrible story that occurred at Waukesha, Wisconsin, when a man drove into the parade of people, killing 6 people and wounding many more. He was out on bail for a violent crime. He should never have been free, but a progressive prosecutor and lax laws allowed him to get out and kill all those people. Research is clear that a huge amount of violent crime in any city is committed by a very small number of repeat offenders. Just think, if police and prosecutors can focus on those offenders, they can improve the situation very significantly. But because of difficulties at the state level in terms of understaffed police departments, progressive prosecutors who turn a blind eye to violent crime, and state legislatures who often soften criminal laws and implement bail reform, states don't seem to be solving this problem, nor are they able and capable of doing it all alone. Federal support is necessary. Congress must treat violent crime as a very top priority. For this reason, last week I introduced Combating Violent and Dangerous Crime Act. The bill contains common sense proposals to reduce the spike in violent crime in the nation, proposals that would expand federal prosecution options for offenses like murder, carjacking, bank robbery, and assault on police. All of my fellow Republicans on this committee have co-sponsored this bill, and I thank them for doing it. The Department of Justice should also be treating violent crime as a top priority, but that's not what we're seeing from this Department of Justice. In the summer of 2020, under the Trump administration, the Department of Justice conducted Operation Legend, which was targeted towards prosecuting violent criminals in places in America that had the worst rate of violent crime. This effort was a supplement to the overstretched state and local law enforcement and court systems, which simply could not deal with the surge in violent crimes that they were seeing. But whenever a question about violent crime comes up, the Department of Justice only wants to talk about gun control, not punishing criminals who commit violent crime. I wrote a letter to the Department of Justice on February the 14th, 2022, to ask the department to answer this misguided and politicized approach to law enforcement. Now, we're here on the subject of this hearing. More than a year ago, the Department of Justice formed a task force on threats to election workers. It appears that only 4 cases have been announced as a result of this task force effort. Now, that's after more than a year's work, just 4. And there have been no charged acts of violence against election workers. These prosecutions may be very worthy, but the existence of a full DOJ task force is confusing. Compared to Operation Legend, which resulted in about 1,500 prosecutions for crimes involving drugs, guns, and violence. All that in less than 6 months. In light of Garland's past focus on intimidating parents who were concerned about school boards, I fear that there is a political element to the decision to focus on this area. This administration doesn't want to talk about the failed policies of Democratic cities where crime is spiking up, but a law enforcement agency like the Department of Justice should not be participating in those sorts of politics. The Department of Justice is the highest law enforcement agency in America. It must focus its priorities on challenges facing America today. That means addressing violent crime. If we can only reduce the homicide numbers to where they were before the defund the police movement, we could save as many as 6,000 lives per year, because that's how much it has spiked up in the last 2 years. Yet there is no murder surge task force, no task force for combating the 20-year high in police killings, no carjacking task force, certainly no task force for the threats and arsons against crisis pregnancy centers and churches in the wake of the Dobbs decision. The Department of Justice is not choosing what to convene task forces on by levels of violence. They're choosing a political message, I believe, and that will have a real consequence on the safety and lives of many Americans. I yield.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. In the current Congress, this Judiciary Committee has held hearings on law enforcement officer safety, mass shootings, domestic terrorism, protecting children from gun violence, carjackings, hate crimes, reducing violence in Chicago, violence against women, and more, including multiple oversight hearings of law enforcement agencies. We have another oversight hearing tomorrow with the director of the FBI scheduled. The subject of this hearing is threats to election workers. We have 2 panels. The first panel, we welcome the Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Polite. Assistant Attorney General Polite is a longtime federal prosecutor who oversees the Justice Department's criminal division, including the Election Threats Task Force. We also welcome Kim Wyman, Senior Election Security Advisor at CISA, the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Prior to CISA, Ms. Wyman, a Republican, served for nearly a decade as Washington's elected Secretary of State, so she certainly knows this field very well, and we welcome her. I'm going to ask them both to be sworn in. They'll then be given 5 minutes each for opening statements, and then a round of questioning from the senators, up to 5 minutes each, and then our second panel will be recognized. If you would please stand. If you raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect both witness answered in the affirmative. Mr. Polite, I'm going to allow you to start.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin.
You want to make sure your mic's on.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting the United States Department of Justice to appear before you today to discuss election threats. Again, my name is Kenneth Polite, and I am the Assistant Attorney General of the Department's Criminal Division, testifying today on behalf of the Department. The Department of Justice is committed to addressing threats to the state and local election community. The courageous and dedicated men and women who are responsible for administering the most fundamental aspect of our democracy, our elections, should not face threats for merely doing their jobs. These victims, often volunteers, are people from across our country and across the political spectrum. These are people we have sworn to protect. Through direct engagement with the election community, training of our federal, state, and local law enforcement agents, grant funding for enhanced election security, and federal criminal investigation and prosecution of election-related threats where appropriate, the Department is working intently to prepare and protect our election officials and their staff as we approach the 2022 midterm elections. Last June, the department launched the Election Threats Task Force to combat the sharp rise in reports of threats received by the election community during and following the 2020 election cycle. Comprised of the Criminal Division's Public Integrity and Computer Crime and Intellectual Property sections, the Civil Rights Division's Voting and Criminal sections, and the National Security Division's Counterterrorism section, as well as the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division, the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. The task force unites the foremost subject matter experts across the government who have deep experience with election-related issues. Over the past year, the task force has proactively engaged with the election community to hear directly from election officials and workers regarding the types of threatening communications that they receive, the challenges such communications pose to election administration, and their greatest concerns and needs with respect to combating physical threats. These conversations are critical to positioning the task force to effectively address threats to the election community and to identify and respond to trends in this area. In response to the expressed needs of the election community, the task force has shared information about the types of communications that election officials and workers have reported nationwide, as shown on our screen today, the legal standards that apply, and how determinations are made on whether to open a criminal investigation, as well as common investigative steps undertaken in these matters. The task force has also provided detailed guidance to the election community on best practices for memorializing threats and reporting such communication to the FBI, has encouraged broad reporting, and has provided contact information for each of the 56 FBI election crime coordinators in field offices throughout the country. The task force is committed to reviewing and assessing all reported threatening and harassing communications directed at the election community to identify where federal criminal prosecution is both appropriate and permissible. Although the vast majority of communications directed at election workers, offensive though they may be, will not constitute true threats subject to federal criminal prosecution due to the robust protections afforded to political speech by the First Amendment, we are committed to following the facts and the law. Political considerations do not and should not play any role in any prosecutorial decision made by the department. Threats to the election community remain a national public safety issue requiring a national response, regardless of politics. The trauma experienced in this community is profound and unprecedented. The department is committed to investigating and prosecuting violations of federal law against those who administer and safeguard our electoral system. I want to assure you that our attention to ensuring the safety and security of those in the election community will not wane. And through these collective efforts, we hope to continue to mitigate and deter threats. We look forward to continuing this work as long as that threat persists. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee for this opportunity to discuss the ongoing work of the department. I would be pleased to respond to your questions.
Thanks, General Polite. Kim Wyman, Senior Election Security Advisor at CISA and 10-year Secretary of State in Washington. Please.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. Free and fair elections are the cornerstone. Oh gosh, I got like 6 words in before the emotion of the video got me. I'm sorry. Are the cornerstone of American democracy. Over the course of nearly 3 decades, I had the opportunity to work in elections at the state and local level, and I strive to make sure that that principle was upheld. Prior to joining CISA, I was blessed to have spent 30 years in Washington state elections, and I began in the early 1990s. My biggest fear was crying in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. By the way, I just have to start there. When I was appointed Thurston County Election Director, and I learned elections from the ground up. In 2001, I was appointed and elected as Thurston County Auditor, which allowed me to make policies that improved elections administration and voter registration. And in 2012, I was elected as Washington Secretary of State, the second woman to serve in that capacity. And in that capacity, I served for about a decade, and I was able to leave in November to become the Senior Election Security Advisor at CISA. Overseeing over 150 elections and serving as the Chief Election Officer at both the state and local level has enabled me to understand the roles and responsibilities of election officials and witness firsthand the challenges that they face. This experience has prepared me to help shape CISA's services and resources to make them more impactful for election officials and voters across the country and make our democracy more resilient. My written statement provides more detailed information about CISA and our mission, but I want to start my remarks today by providing a basic overview of how we support the election community. Our mission at CISA is to ensure the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. In January 2017, the Department of Homeland Security designated election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, which allowed Department of Homeland Security to prioritize federal assistance to the election subsector. CISA's election-focused mission is to ensure that state and local election officials and their private sector partners have the necessary information and tools to successfully manage risk and build resiliency in the nation's election infrastructure. Our support to the election community is bolstered by the work of our federal partners in the intelligence community, in federal law enforcement, and other agencies like the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission and the U.S. Postal Service. Collectively, we have brought incredible resources to bear to support state and local election officials and take a whole-of-government approach to election security. As we approach the 2022 midterms, we at CISA have identified 5 main priorities. First, CISA remains committed to sharing actionable information with election officials about threats and risks to election infrastructure alongside our intelligence community and federal law enforcement partners. Second, we are providing guidance, services, and expertise to help election officials secure voter registration systems and information. Third, we're redoubling our efforts to promote cyber hygiene practices, specifically focused on smaller and mid-sized jurisdictions around the country that oftentimes have difficulty making cybersecurity investments, but which are so critical to the election ecosystem. Fourth, CISA is expanding efforts aimed at building up Americans' resilience against foreign influence campaigns that threaten election infrastructure, security, and seek to undermine public confidence in our elections. Finally, in partnership with the Department of Justice and the broader national security and law enforcement community, we're expanding services and resources that help keep election officials and their voters safe. From our no-cost services, incident response coordination, training and exercise packages, and broader information sharing, it's my hope that we can continue to provide meaningful assistance to our state and local election partners to prepare them for this and future election cycles. The public's confidence in their election and the faith they place in our democratic institutions rests upon the ability to conduct free and fair elections. At CISA, ensuring the security of our election infrastructure is of the highest priority. We shall remain transparent and agile in our vigorous efforts to address new and evolving threats. I thank you for this opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wyman and Mr. Pleat. So I'm going to start with Ms. Wyman. Probably mispronouncing her name, but Lori Augino?
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
She is the Director of Washington State's elections. Is that correct?
She was, yes.
She was. Following the 2020 election, the email and home addresses of Lori Augino were published on a website called Enemies of the People, along with a photo of her face in crosshairs. The website, which amplified the former president's stolen election claims, was subsequently linked to Iran. Ms. Wyman, I know that Ms. Augino is your former colleague. I'm sorry she experienced these threats. How big a problem is doxing, which is general category I've just described? And what is CISA doing to help state and local election officials guard against the release of their personal information online?
Doxing is a problem, and it is across the election community. I apologize, Senator, for getting emotional. Thank you. It was unnerving, as you can tell, when my election director's information was put out. That's part of why I joined CISA, to be honest, is to provide state and local election officials with resources that they don't have. In terms of doxing, we're working with the Department of Justice and law enforcement partners, certainly to get election officials to report incidents like getting their personal information put out on the internet, and mainly trying to build the resilience by helping election officials to have plans and be mindful of what they have out on the internet.
It's hard enough to get people to work on Election Day, isn't it?
Yes.
I found that finding precinct committeemen at Precinct 54 in Springfield, Illinois, to sit there for 12 hours maybe or longer and to get paid a decent sum of money, but certainly not a ransom or a reward for their effort. And now to have these kinds of threats against people, and even threats that endanger their lives, it's got to be even more difficult to recruit people, is it not?
I am hearing from my colleagues across the country that they are having difficulty finding election workers, yes.
So, Mr. Polite, back to your testimony for a minute. You talked about the number of cases that are being prosecuted. Senator Grassley did as well. I was told 5. Senator Grassley referred to 4. You've said how difficult it is to really make a case, even when we have the evidence that we described this morning. Tell me the dilemma we face here. People don't want to work supervising elections and follow the law if they're going to be harassed and intimidated. I don't want them to be harassed and intimidated, but it's happening. So what's your task force doing about it?
Senator, first of all, let me just say I certainly share, and the department shares, the concerns related to the election community that have been raised in the video from Ms. Freeman in particular. It's very powerful testimony. The number of cases that the task force has charged to date is 5. In addition, there have been a number of state prosecutions. I believe the number is 3 at the state level. What I can tell you is that the task force over the last year has been committed and, in fact, conducted a review of every referral of a harassing and offensive communication that it has received. That number is over 1,000. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, Senator, the overwhelming majority of those communications, although they are certainly harassing, they are certainly disturbing, in many cases, the overwhelming majority of cases, they will not satisfy the legal standard that the First Amendment provides for proving a true threat. That is a serious threat of unlawful violence.
What about doxing? Is there anything that you're considering that will protect people like this Washington State Director of Elections from this kind of harassment and intimidation online?
Certainly, Senator. And again, part of this work of the task force is certainly leaning in on enforcement as a tool, but it cannot be the only tool that we are utilizing. It's part of the reason why we have lifted up potential grant funding for election community officials to provide security as necessary. Doxing, as you said, is certainly a very serious issue. And one of the aspects of the task force's work is, in addition to that assessment of each case for potential criminal prosecution, it is also assessed for whether there is an imminent threat of physical violence.
Well, let me ask you, before you go further, and I just have 15 seconds left.
Certainly.
When we do a survey of election officials, most of them don't know you exist. What kind of communication are you sending out that might alert them to the possibility that you're there if needed?
This has been a tremendous amount of outreach to the election community, Senator. Just recently as Monday, I was on a video call with over 600 members of the election community. That is the 3rd such outreach I have done. The task force itself has been involved in outreach to conferences, state and local prosecutors, state and local law enforcement, members of the election community such as national associations, and in fact, I will be speaking at the National Association of Election Officials annual conference at the end of this month.
I'm going to close my questioning by saying that Senator Grassley has raised an important question. Aren't there more important things you could focus on? But if we lose the integrity of our election system that is so fundamental to our democracy, I don't know if we even have a Senate Judiciary Committee when it's all said and done. We've got to really look at the basics, and the basics say protect your democracy and protect the people who, by and large, are not making a fortune, but are volunteering their time in many instances to make this election process work. And for them to be intimidated to the point where they drop out of the picture or, God forbid, there are some results that don't reflect reality, that to me is fundamental to our democracy. I thank you both. Senator Grassley.
I'm going to take off from where the chairman just left off with a point of view that I think is very important, that when we have violence against election officials, it's probably pretty closely tied to a lot of problems we have within our society, including what you've heard most of my opening statement about the rise in crime and what we're doing about it, and we're doing enough about it. Now, I have a big, long lead into my first question that I'm going to summarize because you heard a lot of what I would be repeating now in my opening statement. But in that opening statement, I referred to Operation Legend, Project Safe Neighborhoods. Now, one of the websites of the Department of Justice said, in regard to Project Safe Neighborhood, the fundamental goal of this work is not to increase the number of arrests or prosecutions as if they were an end in themselves. And I think we've seen what the change in philosophy of prosecutions and letting people out have done. So it is very important to combat election violence. But why is it not just as important as my first question, to create a task force dedicated to leverage federal resources against the historic murder rates? Mr. Polite.
Senator, I welcome this question, so thank you very much for raising it. My decision to become a prosecutor in the very first place was motivated to fight violent crime. Like many of us, I have a family that suffered the loss of a loved one due to violent crime. My father and brother are both law enforcement, so a lot of the issues that you're raising are very personal for me. We have a lot of prosecutorial priorities within the Department of Justice and within the Criminal Division. Violent crime is at the very top of that. Today we are here to talk about one category of violent crime, but when we talk about violent crime that we're seeing in our streets and across our country, that remains at the top of the department's priorities as well.
But not as top as creating a task force for, like there is for crime against election officials, evidently.
Senator, respectfully, I would disagree with that. There have been a number of strike forces that have been established and announced by Attorney General Garland in some of the cities across this country that have reflected the highest rates of increases of violent crime. That is in partnership with ATF, that is focused on deterring and addressing violent crime that is being perpetrated by the most culpable individuals in those respective jurisdictions.
Let me follow on where you just left off. Attorney General Garland made statements to this committee indicating that the Department of Justice had formed a task force on, quote, safety of federal prosecutors, law enforcement agencies, judges, members of Congress, end of quote, back in March of 2021. It's not mentioned in any public-facing statement by the Department of Justice, and neither my staff nor the Congressional Research Service has been able to confirm it exists. Does this task force exist, and will the department create a dedicated task force to leverage federal resources to combat the murder of police officers? And if the task force does exist, where do we find that information?
Senator, thank you very much for that question. I can certainly get more details to you related to the task force itself. What I can tell you, though, is that the impetus behind that task force, protecting our law enforcement personnel across this country, it remains a high priority for me, for the division, and for all of the department. It is not limited to just the work of some particular task force. It is, in fact, the work of the entire department and our U.S. attorneys and law enforcement partners on a day-to-day basis.
So far, the department has been unwilling to prosecute those who intimidate Supreme Court justices in their homes, even if the federal statute forbids this behavior? Will you change course and prosecute those who intimidated the justices?
Senator, again, another example of a very high priority, another example of violence in our community addressed against anyone, regardless of their title or status, remains a priority for the department. Just recently, the District of Maryland's U.S. Attorney's Office, in fact, charged one of the individuals that was involved in unlawful, serious, threatening conduct at the home of one of our Supreme Court justices. In addition, our Attorney General has met with law enforcement, federal law enforcement, and has in fact charged the U.S. Marshals with providing additional security for all of our Supreme Court justices.
Can I ask one more question, my last one, and more directly towards this hearing? What resources in terms of agencies supporting, number of staff, and funding have been directed to the Elections Threat Task Force as a result of this use of scarce federal resources? How many individuals have been prosecuted for acts of physical violence against the election officials?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator. We have charged 5 cases as part of the task force. As to any ongoing investigations, I can't comment as to the existence or non-existence of additional investigations.
Did that involve violence, criminal violence against the people?
Those 5 cases all involve serious threats of unlawful violence.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. In my home state of California, I didn't believe this, but election workers in Shasta County have reported increased threats to their safety and well-being. They've received threats that have alluded to the lynching or shooting of election workers. And on election day, they discovered that a camera had been planted near the election office to monitor the movements of election workers traveling to and from the office, putting at risk important personal information like the type of car they drive and their license plate number. So I'd like to ask Assistant Attorney General Polite, how has the Justice Department and the Election Threats Task Force coordinated with states to protect election officials in both ongoing primary elections and the general election later this year?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator. As you've highlighted through your question, coordination with our state and local partners is absolutely vital. Oftentimes, we still see that the communications from members of the public and members of the election community first go not to federal officials, but to those state and local officials, those that they have worked with and have established relationships with. Our outreach to those state and local officials, as a result, has been quite robust. It has included training for a number of those individuals on how to best report as quickly as possible those communications up to our task force so that they can be assessed for both physical threats as well as for potential prosecution.
So you are taking this seriously as a real concern and hopefully can keep us advised of your progress.
Absolutely, Senator.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. We, several months ago, convened a bipartisan working group on things that we needed to do on election laws here. We have one that's on the Electoral Count Act, another one that's referred to as the Enhanced Election Security and Protection Act is something that I think is necessary for us to increase penalties for people. I think in your case, the task force reviewed about 1,000 cases. I think there were about 11%, 100 or so, that were above the threshold that you could potentially seek prosecution. Mr. Polite, do you think it's important for us to up the ante in terms of the penalties for people who are ultimately found guilty?
Thank you, Senator, and you were correct related to the statistics that you cited earlier. I'm familiar with some of the legislative proposals that you referenced. I think any leverage that we can gain in terms of increasing the potential deterrence value of charges, of enforcement actions here is absolutely critical. And so I certainly look forward to working with you in this committee on those proposals.
Mr. Polite, I think it'd be very helpful, since we've now introduced the legislation, it'd be very helpful to get an official position from the DOJ on exactly whether or not we've gotten it right, or there are other things as we work through the process that we should take a look at. Would appreciate that feedback.
I'll commit to that, Senator. Thank you.
Ms. Wyman, thank you for being here and for your service. I don't necessarily think that the challenges we have here know any ideology. I think that there are people that cross the line on both sides or at either end of the political spectrum. In your experience, would you agree with that? Based on your experience, would you agree with that?
Generally, yes, sir.
Yep. I've been a victim of doxing. I've been a victim of death threats. Matter of fact, I just got one over the last week. Actually, he was so intent, he called up twice and said he was going to kill me. This is just unacceptable behavior. And for the election workers, I think that we have to do more. So what specifically is CISA doing? I had one question is, how many, can you give me an idea? We've talked about the cases that the Department of Justice and the task force are looking at. Can you talk to me about how many cases you've been called on to assist with election workers who've been victims of harassment?
How many cases CISA has been called on? I'm not aware of that we're part of that.
Okay. What sorts of resources are you able to provide?
Well, we have cybersecurity and physical protective security advisors out throughout the country as part of CISA, and they are working directly with state and local election officials to help them not only harden their cybersecurity defenses, but really focus on the physical security of their election offices, their polling locations, ballot storage facilities. And so we're working to give them resources like physical security assessments that our protective security advisors can come on site, walk through an election office and give them ideas of ways that they can make it more secure. We have guidance documents like insider threat documents and our guidance and physical security checklists to just really help them proactively think of where the vulnerabilities might be and how they can mitigate them.
Mr. Polite, can you give me an idea of the 11% of well, actually, have any of those been brought to trial?
None have been brought to trial, Senator. One has led to a conviction to date.
One has led to a conviction.
The others remain open.
You mentioned that you have the challenge of where it's just mean but free speech, which is probably what 89 or 89% of the cases were. But can you give me a characterization of some of the cases that you may ultimately bring to trial, of the 100 or so?
Certainly, Senator, I welcome that. And again, these are very disturbing types of threats that were made. For example, when we talk about the Georgia case against defendant Chad Stark, this was a Craigslist post targeting several Georgia officials and local law enforcement, where he said that he was threatening to end the lives of these traitors and take back our country by force, threatened to exterminate these people, and he threatened to put a bullet behind their ears. And again, this is a case that involves victims from across the political spectrum.
That sounds like he's a colleague that left me two voicemail threats just over the last week or so. I hope that they all get convicted and serve time. And I hope that we pass the Election Security and Protection Act so that we can double the damage. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Tillis. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin. Thank you both for being here. Mr. Polite, we are going to hear testimony in the next panel from Michigan Secretary of State that, and I quote, an unprecedented wave of continuous, unrelenting harassment and threats has, and I'm quoting again, that the threats are a direct extension of the efforts to spread false information about the security and accuracy of our elections. We are going to hear, I know from the pre-filed testimony of the Secretary of State of New Mexico, that the conspiracies about our voting and election systems have gripped a certain portion of the electorate and have caused people to take action. And we're going to hear from the executive director of the Colorado County Clerks Association that the deeply held belief among some that our elections are not secure nor accurate has manifested itself as harassment and outright threats on lives. How does DOJ see the linkage between the deliberate campaign of lies about the recent election and violence and threats against election workers?
Thank you, Senator. Again, our focus is on serious threats of unlawful violence. We are sworn to protect our First Amendment rights of our communities. And so political speech is not our focus at all. It is when these threats constitute serious threats of violence that becomes the focus of the work of the Election Threats Task Force.
Are false and fraudulent speech ordinarily subject to legal consequences, whether civil or criminal?
They could potentially, Senator, but again, the focus of the task force itself is on serious threats of unlawful violence.
Indeed, a campaign of lies by the tobacco industry was put to an end by the Department of Justice in a civil proceeding years ago, was it not?
I believe your recollection is correct, Senator.
That prosecution or that civil case was successful. The Department of Justice won. That successful judgment was upheld by the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, and the United States Supreme Court denied cert. There was nothing unconstitutional about the department's action against that campaign of lies, was there?
Senator, and I take your question to highlight the fact that there are a number of potential tools that we should be bringing to bear to address these types of communications, these serious threats of unlawful violence in our communities.
What if there were a plan to propagate a fraudulent lie for the purpose of inciting threats to the larger end of compromising America's election integrity? Would that pattern of facts be beyond the reach of the United States Department of Justice?
Senator, I cannot speak to the existence of any potential investigations. It's tough for me to address the answer.
Not asking you to. I'm asking you basically a legal question, which is, if you had a plan that was designed to propagate a fraudulent lie that had the intention of inciting threats against election officials so as to interfere with the sanctity of American elections, as a matter of law, would that be beyond the reach of the Department of Justice?
Senator, we would certainly take that type of an allegation very seriously. It's a hypothetical, but I can tell you in that circumstance, as we do with all of our cases, we would follow the facts and the law as appropriate.
Well, we draft laws here, and this is the Judiciary Committee. So if there is a gap of some kind in American law that would prevent us from defending our elections in that way, from defending our election workers in that way, and for defending against persistent and deliberate fraud in that way, I would ask you to bring that gap to our attention.
Certainly, Senator. I certainly look forward to working with you on those potential proposals, including gaps in terms of resources related to providing security resources for this election community.
Yeah, because if there's a plan, it's a slightly different thing than if it's just random speech, isn't it?
A planned conspiracy certainly would be different from the substantive underlying conduct. Yes, that's correct, Senator.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being with us. And I think the chairman's right when he says there's no place for violence in our society, and that is a point that we can all agree on, and we should agree on that. Ms. Wyman, it sounds like that you all are putting a tremendous amount of your resources into helping to train, provide guidance, to do assessments for election commissions. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And do you have a dollar amount on that line item?
I'm sorry.
Dollar amount.
I'm On the total budget, I do not know. I can tell you that the election security resilience team that I work with has a $13.2 million budget in the president's budget.
Okay, I would love to have that number.
I can get that
you're
for you.
spending with that local training. I think that would be interesting to see. Back in the 80s, when my kids were little, I served on an election commission, and I always found it very insightful to be on my county's election commission. Mr. Polite, looking at all these resources that are being put into election security, I would be interested to see what the criminal division is doing to help train law enforcement on how to deal with the violations that we've seen against Supreme Court justices. And what you all are doing there, I found it very interesting with tracking General Garland's task forces, that there does not seem to be one that deals with these groups like Jane's Revenge that have gone after the justices at their homes. And that is a violation of federal law. And they should be held to account for that. But that does not seem to be on the priority list. And I also have not seen any kind of work from the criminal division that they are going after many of these same groups who have chosen to attack crisis pregnancy centers or churches. And I think there have been 82 violent attacks against crisis pregnancy centers and churches since Roe v. Wade, that decision in the Dobbs case. Am I missing something? Have you all stood one up and have just not made it public, or is this not a priority?
Senator, thank you again for the question. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't require a task force for us to be, for these types of cases to be priorities for us. What I can tell you, as I mentioned previously, is that very recently, one of our U.S. Attorney's offices in Maryland, in fact, charged a defendant with unlawful conduct at the home of one of our Supreme Court justices. I know that our Attorney General cares deeply about the security of us all, particularly those who are in public service, like yourself and our Supreme Court justices. It's part of the reason why he has leaned in with all of our law enforcement to increase marshal security.
I heard you say that earlier. It is just we look at the task forces that are there. So then what we have to do is say, why is the lack of attention on some of these recent attacks against justices, these recent attacks against crisis pregnancy centers and churches? Why is that not something that you all talk about is a priority for your division? It seems as if there's one set that you are prioritizing, and there is another set that you're saying is not of equal importance. And if you don't treat them equally, if you've got a task force for one but not another, then the perception is that these crimes against the churches and the crisis pregnancy centers, that these are not important to you. We look at what is happening with drugs in our communities. Are you all putting resources into training local law enforcement about how to deal with these drug cartels? In Tennessee, I was speaking with some of our sheriffs last week. I was in 7 different counties on Friday. One of their main issues is that open southern border and the fentanyl that is making it to their streets. And they can't believe DOJ knows these cartels have set up hubs on U.S. soil, and they're running these drugs, they're running these gangs, they're running this sex trafficking that is abusing women and children, but they don't go after those. So I would just ask you to please take back equal treatment and recognition. What is happening to our justices? What is happening to our life centers, our churches, our crisis pregnancy centers? What is happening in our communities with the impact of drugs? That affects people every single day, and it is equally important and deserves the attention of DOJ and the AG. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, could I just briefly respond? Senator, again, all of the types of matters that you raise are high priorities, not just for the criminal division, but for our civil rights division and our civil divisions, particularly on the issue of cartel traffic, cartel activity in the state of Tennessee. I can tell you that the criminal division's organized crime and gang section has been quite active with all of the U.S. attorney's offices in prosecuting and convicting very serious offenders that are members of organized crime organizations in your state.
Senator Hirono?
Ms. Wyman, I agree with you that free and fair elections are the hallmark of American democracy. So I thank the chairman for focusing today's hearing on elections integrity. In fact, we've had a primary elections in certain states, and I note that there are already some winners in the primaries who are saying that if they don't win the general election, it will be because the election has been rigged. That creates an environment that is totally not conducive to election integrity, not to mention what happened and the conspiracy regarding what happened on January 6th and all of the information that the January 6th committee is bringing to light. Mr. Polite, this chart that I have, this is from you. Does this represent the 1,000 or so referrals that have come to the DOJ relating to threats against election workers?
Senator, thank you for the question. The table that you have in front of you was produced in response to the request for additional data by the election community. It reflects some details related to the types of workers that have been targeted by some of these communications, be they state or local or vendors. And then the other table here reflects the mode in which those communications were actually transmitted, and you can see the percentages there.
So it doesn't tell us what kinds of threats have been lodged or sent to these various kinds of workers?
The types of threats?
I'm sorry, the number? It doesn't tell us what the number is of the kinds of threats?
Yes, Senator, this table doesn't reflect that. What I can share with you again is that we have received over 1,000 referrals of harassing, offensive communications, and each and every one of those referrals has been reviewed by the task force for potential prosecution.
We have thousands and thousands of election workers all throughout our country. And yes, there has been a rise in all kinds of threats, verbal, emails, all kinds of threats against our election workers. So the 1,000 referrals sounds like a very small number. What does it take for the DOJ to get a referral?
Senator, the typical path for a referral is two different ways. One, we have had very robust outreach to the election community itself, providing to that community the contact information for both the FBI as well as for the U.S. attorney's offices in their respective jurisdictions, and individuals can make those referrals directly there. In addition, when they have instead directed those referrals to state or local law enforcement, we have outreach and we have trained with those state and local law enforcement partners that they should promptly refer those communications to the FBI for evaluation.
Yeah, well, the point I'm making is by the time that these referrals get to the FBI or to the DOJ, you pretty much have to, it has to be pretty serious, a threat, doesn't it? So it doesn't account for all of the kinds of harassing phone calls, being accosted on the street, et cetera. It does not, those kinds of incidents do not result in referrals to the FBI or the DOJ. I would think not.
It's a fair point, Senator. What I can tell you, like in any area of criminal investigations, underreporting is always a concern. Yes. But what we have tried to do is to encourage the election community to come forward with any type of harassing or offensive communication, regardless of what they evaluated being.
I think that's very important because when I worked on the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, I made it really clear that what we want reported is not just the crimes, what would arise to crimes, but it has to be hate incidents. And there probably are a lot of incidents that ought to be reported so that we have a pretty good, a much more accurate sense of what kinds of environments our election workers are working in. Ms. Wyman, you mentioned that there is a whole of government effort that is required for election security. So is part of that to just provide information to the public that harassing election workers is not okay? Is that part of what you see as a mission for what you do?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We really focus on managing risk and giving guidance to election officials, but certainly these are conversations we're having across the country with local and state election officials, making them aware of the task force and how to report incidents to law enforcement.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I do have one specific question for Ms. Wyman. You noted in your testimony that 93% of all ballots are cast on paper. Do you think it's very important for all states to have paper ballots?
CISA has issued guidance that we think it's a good security measure and a good check and balance, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rono. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to you for being here to answer our questions. Mr. Polite, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay.
Yes, Senator.
In your written testimony, you referenced the, quote, mounting and persistent threats to the safety of election officials and workers across the country. And you described this, I believe, as the justification for the creation for the Election Threats Task Force just over a year ago. You also explained that the vast majority of the complaints are not crimes because of what you described as the robust protections of the First Amendment. This is, in fact, the way our system operates. There are things that people say that people may or may not like, but they are usually protected if they're just speaking words, and those words themselves don't amount to threats or other criminal conduct. They may be First Amendment, protected by the First Amendment. You also have described the fact that it appears from your briefing that since the inception of the task force, you've gotten about 1,000 complaints. Is that right?
That's correct, Senator.
1,000 complaints, and as I understand it, it was just over 100 of those 1,000, so about 1 in 10 of those that were deemed worthy of investigation. Is that also correct?
That's correct, Senator.
And of those 100 out of 1,000 that have been investigated, how many of those have been prosecuted by your office?
To date, Senator, we have prosecuted 5 defendants.
Five defendants. Of those 5 defendants, one, as I understand it, was a prosecution that had begun previously or outside the scope of the task force. Is that also accurate?
I believe you may be referring to the Michigan charge, which was the first one charged by the Department of Justice. That's correct.
So you've got 5 prosecuted out of 1,000 complaints and 100 investigated. What efforts are being made to ensure that your investigations aren't having an undue effect on the chilling of First Amendment protected activity?
Thank you, Senator. And again, we certainly embrace the scope of our First Amendment protections in the political speech, as you were outlining earlier. It's part of the reason why the work of the task force has been so significant. It has involved reviewing each and every one of those communications to see if it actually satisfied the very high bar that's set by our courts for those constitutional parameters.
Glad to hear you're doing that. It makes a lot of sense. Of those prosecutions, the 5 that you mentioned, how many of those involved actual physical acts of violence where contact was made as opposed to threatening language?
Of those 5, Senator, all involved serious threats of unlawful violence.
Was there one that had involved physical contact and somebody had actually used force, or all 5 of them threats of physical violence?
All threats, Senator.
Of those prosecutions, how many of them could have been brought under state law? I mean, I assume from those that I read through the briefings of each of those as you submitted in your written testimony. It appears to me each one of those probably involved multiple violations of law. Some of them involved multiple violations of federal law. I would imagine each of them probably would have amounted to a violation of state law. Is that fair to say?
It's quite possible, Senator. That's not uncommon, that there's oftentimes conduct that could be prosecuted in multiple jurisdictions, federal or state.
Right. So in going through this, it just makes me wonder what exactly amounts to the mounting and persistent threats that the department felt compelled to create a task force specifically for this, where in a year you've gotten 1,000 complaints, 100 worthy of investigation, 5 worthy of prosecutions. When especially it appeared to me on the face of it, each of those cases, if they wouldn't also have been things that could have and would have been prosecuted under state law in the absence of federal action, they probably are the sorts of things that would have been prosecuted in the normal course of business at the federal level in appropriate cases. And so it makes me wonder whether the task force is necessary or necessary relative to other things. The concern here is not that they're doing this task force. The concern is whether that task force could take away other priorities for other crimes. Has the Department of Justice created a task force, for example, on unprovoked attacks on police officers?
Again, Senator, I think the fact that the Election Threats Task Force exists, part of its fundamental role is coordination with state and local law enforcement officials. A number of those cases have also been charged by state jurisdictions as well.
I understand. I do worry about that. I mean, we had 25 unprovoked attacks on law enforcement officers in 2021, up from just 2 the year before. 133 ambush attacks on police were attacked relative to the previous year, in which 60 officers were shot in these attacks. As far as federal crimes against members of the judiciary, under Section 1507 of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, federal law prohibits picketing or parading outside of a court or a judge's residence, quote, with the intent of interfering with, obstructing, or impeding the administration of justice, or with the intent of influencing any judge, juror, witness, or court officer. So protesters outside the justices' homes, since the May 2nd leak of the draft opinion in the Dobbs case, have not been shy about their intent to intimidate and otherwise influence Supreme Court justices, particularly those listed, those believed to be likely to join the draft majority opinion that was leaked. To my knowledge, not a single charge has been brought under Section 1507. You mentioned in your testimony United States versus Caitlin Jones, which I agree is a disturbing case that needed to be prosecuted. Are you aware of similarly disgusting and also much more persistent attacks on Justice Kavanaugh's wife and children? And what about similar threats against Justice Barrett and her children? And all this to say nothing of the fact that we had an assassination attempt on Justice Kavanaugh's life. We shouldn't have to have an assassination attempt to understand the gravity of these threats against members of the judiciary. But meanwhile, you've got groups like Ruth Sent Us and Jane's Revenge who are openly publishing the addresses of these justices. In some cases, apparently distributing information about their children, where they go to school, resulting in threats and attacks on them. My point here is that I hope within the department you're being fair. I would ask within the department that you're looking out for how many of those cases are being investigated and prosecuted. And if you've got a task force for this conduct, task force receiving 1,000 complaints, 100 investigations resulting in a total of 5 prosecutions, I would hope that you would have a few to look at violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 1507. Thank you.
Senator, if I may respond very quickly. Senator, the prioritization of threats against anyone, particularly those who are in public service, is absolutely vital for us. What I can tell you is that our Attorney General has announced additional resources from our Marshal Service in order to protect our Supreme Court justices. In addition, very recently, our U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Maryland has charged the defendant related to unlawful conduct that was being conducted in front of the home of one of those Supreme Court justices. So we don't operate purely through task forces in terms of the priorities of our division or our department.
Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin, and thank you, Mr. Polite and Ms. Wyman, for your testimony, just by noting how weak and unpersuasive I find the arguments being offered here today to try to muddy the waters or suggest that for the federal government and the Department of Justice, the protection of our electoral processes, institutions, and workers is not a vital mission and core essential to the functioning of our democracy, absolutely worthy of high-level attention from the department. And the Department of Justice, Mr. Chairman, has the ability to protect the federal judiciary, to protect high-level federal officials, to go after organized crime and violent crime, and to coordinate the robust protection of our nation's electoral processes. And I find it necessary, having heard some of this commentary from our colleagues today, to remind my colleagues of what happened in Georgia, where amidst Donald Trump's endless barrage of lies, some of them amplified by members of this body, as he sought to hold on to power by any means necessary, Republican election officials in Georgia were warning that it constituted a threat to the lives of election workers. The House committee heard a couple of weeks ago from 2 election workers in Georgia who described the threats of lynchings that they received for doing their jobs to carry out free and fair elections in this country. So I am astounded, Mr. Chairman, that our colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee have decided, with the opportunity to hear from 2 senior officials about what they're doing to protect the integrity of our election processes, are instead diminishing the threat or suggesting that this isn't an appropriate use of federal resources. Now, with that said, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Polite, about what specific steps you are taking to ensure that the facilities and personnel who will be administering elections in my state of Georgia and other states across the country where there's been an elevated level of threat against election workers and facilities, to ensure that these midterms are carried out in a way that ensures the will of the American people is manifest, no matter whether that will favors one party or the other at the ballot box, without violence or threats of violence disrupting the process.
Thank you, Senator. And I am mindful that one of the charged cases for us relates to the conduct in your state of Georgia against defendant Chad Stark. I cited earlier some of the very disturbing threats made by the defendant against a number of election officials that span the political spectrum in your state, including language such as that he threatened to put a bullet behind the ears of a number of these officials. What I can tell you is that the Election Threats Task Force is taking this conduct very seriously. Our outreach to the election officials community has been extensive, it has been robust, it has been ongoing, it will continue to be amplified. I myself will be conducting additional outreach directly to the National Association of Election Officials at the very end of this month. What we have lifted up to them are best practices related to how to best memorialize threats that they receive and how best to report those threats going forward. In addition, we have lifted up additional resources that are available to them, be it Burn JAG dollars or Helping Americans Vote Act grant dollars that can be used to help protect election officials and their staff in their facilities as we prepare for the next election cycle.
Thank you. I introduced last year the Election Worker and Polling Place Protection Act to strengthen the laws that protect the facilities and personnel critical to free and fair elections in the United States. Can you comment on the importance from your perspective ensuring that not just those personnel who are working the polls, either in a staff or a voluntary basis, but also the facilities, and that includes, Ms. Wyman, from your perspective, the software, hardware, digital infrastructure, but that the facilities are protected from threats of physical violence, of hacking, and so on. From you, please, briefly, Mr. Polite, and then in closing, you, Ms. Wyman. Thank you.
All significant priorities, Senator. And again, I'm familiar with the proposed legislation, and we look forward to working with your committee on that.
Thank you, Ms. Wyman.
And Senator, thank you for the question. That is exactly what the work we're doing with election officials across the country is, helping them with guidance and tools to not only secure their cyber infrastructure, but to have protective security advisors come on site and walk through facilities to make sure they're secure, having incident response plans in place so that they know how to respond if there is a threat of violence or something in a polling location or election office, and then really just doing last mile products where we're targeting local election officials that are medium and small sized jurisdictions to have incident response plans that they can have, phone numbers and contacts at the desk of each staff member. So we're working very hard to prepare them for the upcoming elections.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Your chart reflects the threats to election workers that come from social media, 26% here. The Brennan Center actually has reported that 95% of election officials blame social media companies for allowing their platforms to peddle outright lies and conspiracy theories and other kinds of threats. Nearly 2 in 3 election officials said that this false information makes their job more dangerous. First, let me thank you both for your excellent work on this issue and your dedication to protecting those election workers. And then to ask you how severe you regard the threat posed by this misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, MDM on social media, and what can be done about it.
Thank you, Senator. As the chart reflects, social media platforms have been a significant method of communication, of transmitting these types of communications. It's part of the reason why the task force, in addition to its outreach to the election community, as well as our state and local law enforcement partners, it has included outreach to a number of those social media operators for their assistance, for their support. These are the types of cases that cannot be done in isolation. We also need the assistance of those social media platforms quite frequently in detecting and reporting these communications going forward.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes, at CISA, we really have a risk management-based approach. And so what we try to do is first build resilience within the American public, making them aware that malign actors use dis, and malinformation to try to undermine people's confidence in our elections and to try to, quite frankly, put Americans against each other and sow discord. So we create products that try to illustrate how those tools are used against Americans, and we also work with our state and local partners to create resources to give election officials ways to mitigate that.
Do you think that social media is doing enough on its own to stop the misuse of its platforms?
Again, we work with them to manage the risk and make them aware of what we're seeing in the election community, and the social media companies use their own rules and terms of service to mitigate it.
They have huge resources. Are they doing enough?
I don't know that there's ever going to be enough that we can do. I've been in this profession for 30 years, and I've never seen this level of feedback, if we will, about an election this far after an election that is targeting election officials in the way that has been since 2020. So I'm not sure that there is enough that anyone can do.
General Polite?
I agree with my colleague, Senator. There is more to be done by all of us, frankly, including a number of those social media platforms, in assisting us in detecting and ultimately transmitting these types of very threatening and disturbing communications to law enforcement as quickly as possible.
Well, I know that you're reluctant to pass judgment on social media companies, but part of the encouragement they need is for public officials to speak up and urge them to do more. And clearly, as you've observed, there's more that they can and should do. They have the resources, the access, the knowledge, and the power to do more. And the American public, and including law enforcement officials like yourself, urging them to do more, indeed demanding them to do more, I think is part of the solution. So I would perhaps encourage you to be, and the Department of Justice to be, more robust in what you're requesting of them.
Thank you, Senator. And again, we have had significant outreach, very direct conversations with a number of those companies. My commitment to you is that that outreach and that level of communication with them will continue to be a priority for the task force.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to begin by just echoing some of the comments made a few minutes ago by Senator Ossoff, and just disgust I feel at some of our colleagues, including members of this committee, in their efforts to minimize, if not outright dismiss, the significance and the magnitude of the threats to our democracy that we're discussing here today. But in the spirit of the second part of Senator Ossoff's message, to make sure we're maximizing the time and the talent of the witnesses before us, let me proceed to my questions. There's really two areas that I want to get to in this first panel. The first is for Mr. Polite.
Yes, sir.
Now, in an era where election workers rightfully fear that they're under increased threat from election deniers and others who may wish them harm, it's critical that the federal government demonstrate that it stands ready to respond to the election community's concerns. And doing that, as you've heard from others, requires an adequate allocation of resources to the problem. I know when I was serving as Secretary of State for California, one of the things that became a normal practice was making rounds at all the fusion centers in state. In a state as big as California, there's more than one or two, to make sure that it's not just federal agencies and state agencies that are coordinating, but across state agencies and across federal agencies. My question is specific to U.S. attorneys' offices. In each of the U.S. attorneys' offices across the country, and in each of the FBI field offices, is there an assistant U.S. attorney and a special agent assigned specifically to the task of either responding to or coordinating a response to concerns raised about election threats?
Yes, Senator. This is not an issue, this is not a problem that we can solve exclusively from Washington, D.C. It requires coordination with state and local officials, and it certainly requires coordination with each of our U.S. attorney's offices and our FBI field offices. What we have in each U.S. attorney's office is what is called a district election officer. That is a trained, specialized prosecutor on these types of election-related crimes. And then in each of the 56 FBI field offices, there is also an election crimes coordinator, again, a specialized agent focused on these types of offenses.
That's great to hear, and for the public to hear. As a follow-up to that question, whether it's in each of these offices or in each of the task forces, national or local, are the individuals involved specifically assigned to this elections threat-related work, or are they taking this election threat-related work in addition to other duties and responsibilities?
It is oftentimes, I would say, in the overwhelming majority of these cases, these U.S. attorneys' offices have these U.S. attorneys' officials have additional collateral responsibilities within the office. Their focus is on election-related crimes broadly defined, so they are members of this election threats task force, but any election-related offense that may come forward and be referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for investigation or prosecution, those U.S. attorneys, those AUSAs are oftentimes involved as well.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Wyman, good to see you again.
You as well.
As you know, I previously served as California's Secretary of State and therefore California's Chief Elections Officer, and I, along with you, learned that CISA was a critical partner in helping us achieve a successful election that allowed, I'm going to brag a little bit here, in California, more Californians participating in 2020 than in any election previously, and they did so safely when they went to cast their ballot. That's what I really hope that this sort of collaboration between CISA and state and local elections partners is continuing to do. I'm sure you benefited when you were Washington Secretary of State, but now you're on the other side of the table. And so can you describe, from this point of view, CISA's level of engagement with state and local officials, including on the issue of addressing and responding to election threats, and whether there's any barriers to collaboration that this committee and Congress can help address?
Thank you, Senator, for for that question. And by the way, Washington also had a very high turnout in 2020, highest record turnout. Not that we're competitive. CISA really is focusing on trying to first and foremost make election officials at the state and local level aware of the work that Department of Justice is doing in this space, and aware of the services that are available not only by our agency but other federal agencies. And we're doing this by going out to election conferences, working with our protective service advisors and cybersecurity advisors located across the country, in fusion centers often, and really just trying to get that word out so that election officials know not only to report immediate threats, because that, as the senator earlier mentioned, that's part of the problem, is reporting all of the threats that are out there, but also knowing that they can work with state and local or state and federal law enforcement partners to secure their election system and people.
If there's anything else this committee or Congress can do to be of assistance, please don't hesitate, including, as Senator Blumenthal mentioned, additional resources.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the witnesses.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Polite,
Yes, Senator.
I am highly concerned that this Department of Justice is politicizing the enforcement of justice. You've discussed how there is a priority focused on elections, and I recognize that there is a political focus on that, although, as you've told this committee, out of 1,000 complaints, it produced a total of 5 prosecutions, none of which involved violence, and all of the 5 were based on threats. Serious threats of violence should be investigated and should be prosecuted. However, in the weeks after the Dobbs opinion was leaked, pregnancy centers in Portland, Oregon, Manassas, Virginia, Austin, Texas, and Frederick, Maryland were targeted and vandalized. Violent extremist group Jane's Revenge took credit for fire bombings of crisis pregnancy centers in Madison, Wisconsin, in Amherst, New York, in Buffalo, New York, in Des Moines, Iowa, and in Gresham, Oregon. More recently, centers in North Carolina and in Washington, D.C., just 500 yards from where you're sitting right now, were covered with red paint, were egged, and were graffitied by pro-abortion radicals. As of July 22nd, there have been at least 82 violent attacks against pro-life institutions, including churches and crisis pregnancy centers. Despite these very real threats and violent attacks against pregnancy centers, DOJ instead, on July 12th, set up a special, quote, reproductive rights task force, not to protect pregnancy centers, but instead to advocate the political agenda of this administration of expanding unlimited abortion on demand. I have zero doubt that if pro-life supporters were vandalizing and firebombing abortion clinics across the country, DOJ would declare it a national emergency, and you might well send out the National Guard. But because your politics and the politics of the agency you work with happen to agree with the vandals, there has been no task force, there has been no priority. Why is that?
Senator, respectfully, I believe we agree that politics cannot and should not play any role in the investigative and prosecutorial decisions of the Department of Justice. We take very seriously any incidents of violence that occur within this country. I can tell you that those incidents that you're reflecting upon, if they are ultimately being considered by the Department of Justice, they will be taken.
Hold on a second. If they're being considered, you don't know sitting here today if they're being considered?
Senator, a number of these incidents are priorities in the focus not just of the criminal division, but of the civil division as well as our civil rights division.
Is there a task force?
Senator, it doesn't take a task force
So
for us
no.
to have a
Have any
prioritization
cases
of
been brought?
combating violence across this country.
Have any cases been brought?
Senator, I cannot comment on the existence of any current or pending investigations at this time.
Well, you're here commenting on the existence of when it meets the political priorities of the White House. All right, let me ask you a different question.
Yes, Senator.
Simultaneously, while violent terrorists are threatening pregnancy centers, we also have had protesters at the homes of Supreme Court justices night after night after night. Now, I believe protesting at someone's home where your spouse sleeps, where your children sleeps, is inherently threatening. It is designed to be threatening. And we know the violent rhetoric with the encouragement of Democratic members of Congress resulted in at least one deranged individual traveling from California to Maryland to attempt to murder Justice Kavanaugh. Now, as it so happens, Congress has addressed this issue. It's passed 18 U.S.C. Section 1507, making it a crime to protest at the home of a Supreme Court justice while a case is pending. Night after night after night, these protesters committed federal crimes on national television. Why has the Department of Justice refused to enforce 18 U.S.C. Section 1507?
Senator, very recently, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland, in fact, has prosecuted a defendant for unlawful conduct in front of the home of one of our Supreme Court justices.
So one person?
To date, there has been one prosecution.
And what about
to
the
date.
hundreds of others? All of whom have violated the law. On the face of it, it's not complicated. The law is very clear. Why does the Department of Justice pick and choose which laws to enforce, which criminal laws to enforce, and why does it seem to exactly follow the pattern of the partisan preferences of the Biden White House?
Again, Senator, politics should play and does not play any role in our prosecutorial decisions. What I will also add is that our Attorney General has increased the U.S. Marshal Service's resources
But
that
why
are
has
brought
there
to bear
been
to
only one
protect our Supreme
prosecution
Court
under Section 1507? Why have there not been any others?
Senator,
Does the department believe the law is unconstitutional? And if not, why are you refusing to enforce it?
respectfully, Senator, I disagree that we've chosen not to enforce it. Again, there's been one prosecution of a
Out of
defendant.
hundreds, what about the rest of the hundreds?
Senator, again, I cannot comment on the current status of potential investigations in this area.
Final question, was the one prosecution you referenced a 1507 prosecution, or was it something else?
I don't believe it was under that statute.
So you haven't brought a single one?
Again, I believe the conduct itself was the focus of the prosecution that you're
Well,
raising.
I think you need to follow the law.
There are no further senators seeking questions. Political violence in furtherance of any cause is unacceptable. I condemn all violence and threats of violence in the strongest possible terms, regardless of whether it comes from the right or the left, whether it targets election workers, judges, law enforcement officers, or other public officials. Unfortunately, abortion providers and reproductive health care clinics have long been the target of violence, threats, harassment, and intimidation. According to the FBI, actors motivated by anti-choice beliefs have historically perpetuated the most lethal attacks and also commit the majority of nonviolent criminal violations when it comes to attacks involving reproductive rights. Assaults directed at abortion clinic staff and patients increased 128% in 2021 compared to 2020, according to a report from the National Abortion Federation. Beyond the surge of assaults outside of clinics, the study also documented a 600% increase in stalking, 63% increase in burglary, 54% increase in vandalism, 163% increase in hoax devices or suspicious packages, 80% increase in bomb threats, 128% increase in invasions, including instances in which protesters forcefully entered clinics, and an increase in hate mail, harassing phone calls, and death threats. We know the FBI is investigating attacks and threats of violence following the overturning of Roe v. Wade and is working with local law enforcement. We need to take seriously all these violent threats. And I might add that this committee has passed legislation, sent it to the floor, which would provide additional resources to protect all federal judges after a terrible incident occurred in New Jersey. That measure has been on the floor for weeks at a time. It is being held up by one senator from the Republican side. That is a fact. We're trying our best to put the resources to protect our judges. We need cooperation on both sides of the aisle to achieve that. And I'll close by saying, as important as all of these issues of violence are, the nature and purpose of this hearing was to address the undermining of the integrity of America's election system. I happen to think that's fundamental too, and it goes to the heart of our constitutional form of government. I now thank the panel for their testimony. You may receive some written questions. I hope you'll respond to them in a timely way. Thank you very much. Ask the staff to set up the second panel for their testimony as well.
Thank you.
I'm going to start reading the biographies of our members on the second panel so that we can keep moving this along. Starting with Jocelyn Benson, Michigan's 43rd Secretary of State, expert on election law, civil rights law, education law, previously Dean of Wayne State University Law School in Detroit. Maggie Toulouse Oliver, New Mexico's 26th Secretary of State. Before her 2016 election as Secretary of State, she served for nearly a decade as county clerk in New Mexico. Amy Cohen, Executive Director of NASED, the National Association of State Election Directors, professional organization representing nonpartisan officials who administer our elections. Matt Crane. Matt's the Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association. He is a Republican. He served as election administrator in Colorado for 21 years, including serving from 2013 through 2018 as the elected clerk and recorder for Arapahoe County. I now turn to Senator Grassley to introduce his witnesses.
Mike Hurst served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Mississippi, 2017 to 21. He was unanimously confirmed. Previously, he served 8 years as an assistant U.S. Attorney and director at the Mississippi Justice Institute and general counsel at the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. As U.S. Attorney, Mr. Hurst increased prosecutions in his district by 178%. He launched Project Eject under the Department of Justice Project Safe Neighborhood Initiative to help reduce violent crime. He is now a partner at Phelps Dunbar. Raphael Mangual is a Nick Udell Fellow and Head of Research for the Policing and Public Safety Initiative at the Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. He has written articles on criminal justice for many publications: Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, New York Post, New York Times, Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer. His book came out last week with the title Criminal Injustice: What the Push for Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts Most. Jason Johnson served as Deputy Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department from 2016 to 18. Before that, he was a police officer at Prince George County, 18 years, reaching the rank of major. He also served as Assistant Commander, Special Investigation Division, and Commander of the Office of Legal Affairs and Internal Affairs Division. He's currently the President of Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. Mr. Mangual, Mr. Hurst, Mr. Johnson, we thank you very much for your service and testifying today.
If you'll all please rise for the oath. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record reflect that the panel has answered in the affirmative, and so now they are permitted to speak. And we start with Ms. Benson. Thank you. Make sure your microphone is on.
Thank you, Chairperson Durbin.
5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. As Michigan's Chief Election Officer, my responsibility is to ensure our elections are accessible, safe, secure, and that the results are an accurate reflection of the will of the people. This is not a partisan role, and despite it being an elected position, it's not a political role. But it is a role that increasingly forces us, Republicans, Democrats, or independents, to endure threats, harassment, false and malicious attacks on our character and integrity, and sometimes even violence. I'm here today because we need your help. We cannot have a secure democracy if we do not protect the security of the people who administer our elections. And right now, we are facing an unprecedented wave of continuous, unrelenting harassment and threats. Enduring these threats creates a near constant strain of anxiety and stress on our work. The status quo is unsustainable and unacceptable. I've experienced these threats firsthand. One night in December 2020, I was about to put my son to bed when dozens of individuals descended upon our home. Growing in numbers over the course of an hour, they stood outside my front door, waking my neighbors, shouting obscenities and graphic threats into bullhorns. To this day, these images and this memory of that evening still haunts me. This was not the first, nor was it the last time some time or a group of people showed up at my home or threatened me, my staff, or many of the hundreds of local election officials in our state. As a result, there is an omnipresent feeling of anxiety and dread that permeates our daily lives and those of our families. Not long ago, my son, standing in our driveway, picked up a stick, turned to me and said, "Don't worry, Mom. If the bad guys come again, I'll get them with this." He's 6 years old. Some of these incidents have been reported and drawn media attention. Many have not. From Rochester Hills clerk Tina Barden, she received a voicemail filled with explicit language threatening her family. Detroit City Clerk Janice Winfrey was sent photos of a dead body with a message to imagine that body as her daughter. Other clerks beyond Michigan have told countless more stories. Local officials from political parties of both sides enduring threats to their families and their staff. These threats are not limited to personal attacks. They also involve harassment and attempts to criminalize the basic work of local election officials. We are threatened with arrest for simply doing our jobs, for educating citizens about their right to vote, or we are inundated with burdensome and often nonsensical, unnecessary demands for information and access to secure election equipment. As a result, 1 in 3 election officials report feeling unsafe on a regular basis, and more than half fear for the safety of their colleagues in future elections. And this is why we need your help. I'm grateful that a group of your colleagues have reached bipartisan agreement on reforms to the Electoral Count Act, but that is not enough. Imposing stronger penalties on those who would threaten or harm anyone involved in election administration is an important step, as is extending the same protections for the personal information of election officials that has been considered or extended to federal judges. The bottom line is we need you to act because many states like Michigan are failing to do what is necessary to protect us. For months, local election officials and I have pleaded with Michigan lawmakers to set aside money to protect us, even after threats of violence and sometimes death are levied at us and our families. Despite months of specific requests and a budget surplus, they have failed to offer anything to protect us. So you, as national leaders, can do something to demonstrate that you're willing, not just to protect all of us, but protect democracy. Like many of my colleagues, I have spent my career defending and protecting the right to vote of every eligible citizen. That commitment has never wavered, and it will not waver now. But we need you to share that commitment with us. We need you to stand with us to pass new protections, additional protections now, before it's too late.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Hurst?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, other distinguished members of this committee, I appreciate the invitation to testify today on this very important topic. As the former United States Attorney for the Southern District of Mississippi, as well as a line federal prosecutor for almost a decade before, including a stint as the district election officer, I hope to be able to provide some insights to this committee on this subject, protecting our democracy's frontline workers. Now, from the outset, let me say unequivocally that no one should be threatened. But if someone is threatened, law enforcement should respond appropriately, investigate such threats, and bring those to justice who have violated our criminal laws. That being said, as American citizens, we must question whether our Department of Justice should be focusing its precious time and finite resources on threats against election workers when, in my opinion, there exists a much more dire and pressing crisis affecting the American public, and that is the rising violent crime surging throughout our country. Considering that the Department of Justice's task force, created just over a year ago to address threats to election officials, has produced only 5 cases and over 1,000 referrals, it has to be asked why this issue is such a priority for this department, considering that over the past 2 years, in 2020 and 2021, we have seen more than 6,000 additional people murdered in the United States when compared to 2019. But there is hope. The Department of Justice has provided much-needed leadership in the past in reducing violent crime and can do so again today. After decades of declining crime rates, our nation began to see an uptick in violent crime in 2015. In 2017, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions and later Attorney General William Barr began implementing policies and initiatives to tackle violent crime head-on, including a reinvigorated Project Safe Neighborhoods program, Project Guardian, and Operation Legend, among others. Because of the leadership by DOJ and the successful implementation of these and many other programs, the nation experienced 3 consecutive years from 2017 to 2019 of declining violent crime. First, let me mention Project Safe Neighborhoods. That's an initiative which brings together all levels of law enforcement, prosecutors, community leaders, and other stakeholders in order to identify, address, and reduce violent crime in individual communities, and led by our U.S. Attorney's offices throughout the nation. Shortly after being sworn in as United States Attorney, I launched in the city of Jackson, Mississippi, our new PSN initiative called Project Eject, which stood for Empower Jackson, Expel Crime Together. By focusing not just on prosecuting violent criminals, but also teaching prevention in our schools, conducting outreach in our communities, and holding reentry fairs to help reduce recidivism among offenders, we began to make a real difference in Jackson. In the first year Project Eject was implemented, Jackson experienced a 7% reduction in overall violent crime, which meant that approximately 108 people did not become victims of violent crime that year. Sadly, Jackson has recently experienced a resurgence in violent crime, becoming the murder capital of America in 2021, when it had 155 homicides, the highest murder rate per capita in the nation, more than 3 times higher than Chicago's, Mr. Chairman, which had the most murders overall in 2021. Another effective strategy previously implemented by DOJ is Operation Legend, mentioned by Ranking Member Grassley. Launched in July of 2020 in Kansas City, Missouri, it temporarily reassigned and surged federal law enforcement officers into cities that were experiencing significant and worsening violent crime. In the first 6 months of its operation in over 9 cities, DOJ arrested more than 6,000 violent criminals, including almost 500 murder suspects, seized more than 2,600 firearms, confiscated kilograms of fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin, and more than $11 million in drug and other illicit proceeds. In the cities where it was implemented, Operation Legend quickly and effectively reduced violent crime. Let me conclude by saying that the most important role of government is to protect its citizens, and DOJ can once again lead in this arena. However, the department must quickly reprioritize its goals, redirect its resources to proven programs that have reduced violent crime and saved lives, and expeditiously act in order to prevent the next person from becoming a victim of violent crime. By working with local, state, and law enforcement, as well as our citizens and other stakeholders, DOJ can once again reduce violent crime and make a real positive difference in the people's lives in our communities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hurst. Ms. Oliver?
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today to discuss and for organizing this hearing on how we can protect our nation's election administrators. Election administration in the United States is conducted at the state, county, and local levels by civil servants and volunteers who do their duty every day for the good of our democracy. This work is vital to how we elect our leaders and how we organize our way of life, but its legitimacy is being threatened. Election administration might seem somewhat simple from the voter's perspective. If you register, fill out a ballot a couple times a year, view the results, and that's pretty much it. Conducting elections, however, is a complex, continual process with highly technical components that ensure accuracy in results and overall security. These technical aspects, like software for vote tabulation machines, the distribution of secured ballot drop boxes, or the use of mailed ballots, have become the foundation of false narratives that call into question the integrity of our entire democratic process. Our nation's election workers have been caught in the crossfire and have themselves become the targets of harassment and threats. Lies and misinformation about how America's elections are run and about the people who run them have proliferated to an unprecedented degree since 2020. Among a significant portion of the country, the continuous drumbeat of these lies has created an atmosphere of distrust in our elections and in our election officials. Of course, the wild conspiracy theories about our elections that began with the big lie of 2020 are not true, and no one has ever produced a credible shred of evidence to support them. But the consequences of these lies have real-world impacts, especially for those of us who are election officials. A recent poll of 600 election officials found that more than half were concerned about their colleagues' safety, with nearly 1 in 3 saying they know a colleague who has quit because of safety concerns. For people who believe their government is corrupt and their leaders are not legitimate, threats of physical violence and acts of imitation have sadly begun to seem like acceptable responses. In New Mexico, the conspiracies about our voting and election systems have caused certain individuals to act on those wild theories. During the 2020 election cycle, I was doxxed, my life was threatened, and had to leave my home for weeks under state police protection. My office has since utilized services for both me and members of my staff that prevent doxing by scrubbing personal identifying information from the internet. Since 2020, my office has experienced social media trolling, aggrieved emails and calls, and other communications that parrot the misinformation circulating nationwide. More recently, since our June primary election, my office has experienced pointed and specific threats serious enough to be referred to law enforcement. In June, for example, there were both threatening phone calls and emails against me that were referred to the FBI for investigation. These threats came after my office began directly combating election misinformation through a new website, and shortly after a nationally publicized situation in Otero County, New Mexico, where the county commission, motivated by the same misinformation we're seeing around the country, initially refused to certify the primary election results, almost causing a breakdown in the democratic process in our state. My office had to then sue the commission in our state Supreme Court to compel them just to perform their simple legal duty. Growing distrust about our election system leads to either apathy or indignation, both of which are detrimental to our entire system of government. For the election officials and volunteer poll workers that our elections depend on, I fear that threats and harassment will cause them so much stress and uncertainty that they will simply give up the work. For voters, I fear that the flood of misinformation will compel them to lose trust in the system and they will no longer participate in our democracy. Federal and state law enforcement agencies are taking these threats seriously and are diligently investigating them, and for that we are very thankful. We must show the public that threats against election officials will not be tolerated. However, legal action is the last line of defense. We will not stop such threats until the lies stop. The rhetoric gets ratcheted down, and elected officials, the media, political parties, and others find better ways to come together and educate the public about the realities of how our elections are conducted and secured. The federal government can help states and election workers by providing resources to be used in the protection of election offices and personnel. For example, personal information protection like the kind my office is employing to protect myself and our staff. I hope my testimony today is helpful for the committee and your future work. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Oliver. Mr. Manguel, did I pronounce it correctly?
You did, Senator. Thank you.
Please proceed.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, I'd like to begin by thanking you all for the invitation to address this distinguished body. I'm going to focus my testimony today on what I believe to be an incredibly important issue that warrants a robust federal response. That issue is the recent rise of serious violent crime. After peaking in the early 1990s, serious violent crimes like murder, aggravated assault, and robbery declined sharply, gains that held at the national level through the mid-2010s. As I've written elsewhere, what has become to be known as the Great Crime Decline represents one of the greatest achievements in urban American history. The decline absolutely transformed my home city of New York into one of the safest, most dynamic urban centers in the world. Many cities across America saw similar transformations. Unfortunately, those gains seem to be at risk. In 2015 and 16, homicides increased by 10.8% and 7.9% respectively, and after leveling off for a few years, the nation's homicide rate spiked in 2020 by 30%, which Pew reported was the single largest one-year spike since at least 1905 and possibly ever. While a comprehensive national count has not yet been released, indications are that the national homicide rate increased again in 2021. Now, while 2020 saw the largest homicide spike on record, overall index crimes, an aggregation of 8 serious crime categories tracked by the FBI, were down, seemingly creating a divergence between homicide specifically and crime generally. However, it is important to note that overall crime measures might have actually masked what was a more serious problem thanks to the pandemic-driven changes in people's routine activities that caused them to spend more time at home and less time in public spaces. Indeed, some analysts found that when controlling for the amount of time people actually spent outside, the data in some cities revealed that one's risk of being victimized actually went up in 2020, even in the crime categories that saw overall decreases. Analyzing foot traffic, researchers from the University of Pennsylvania and the Naval Postgraduate School found that, quote, people in public spaces were 15 to 30% more likely to be robbed or assaulted. In each of the cities analyzed in that study, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, index offenses are now up substantially through the first half of July. Now, some in the media have cautioned against making too much of recently elevated crime levels by highlighting that while serious violence did indeed spike in 2020 and remains elevated, things were much worse in the early 1990s. And this is true on a national level, but it's not true for many of America's major cities. Philadelphia, Louisville, Indianapolis, Columbus, Austin, Tucson, St. Paul, Portland, Albuquerque, Toledo, Baton Rouge, Rochester, New York, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Milwaukee, and Memphis, Tennessee all set homicide records in 2021. Others logged their highest homicide tallies since at least 1990 in 2020. And that list includes Cincinnati, Trenton, Kansas City, Jacksonville, Denver, Cleveland, Jackson, Wichita, Greensboro, Lansing, and Colorado Springs. St. Louis set a new record for a homicide rate in 2020, and Shreveport, Louisiana, Baltimore, Maryland, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Tulsa, Oklahoma all came dangerously close to their all-time homicide records in 2020. As I wrote in the Wall Street Journal last year, Chicago, Seattle, and Fort Worth, Texas would all have to go back 25 years to see homicide tallies comparable to what they were seeing then. Now, as troubling as the statistics I've mentioned thus far may sound, national and citywide rates mask an important reality that we should all consider when discussing the issue of serious violent crime, which is that victimization is hyper-concentrated both geographically and demographically, which means that a very small slice of our country is bearing the brunt of what is among our biggest social problems. To illustrate this point, consider the following. In a given year, somewhere in the range of 2% of U.S. counties see somewhere in the range of 50% of U.S. murders, while 60% of U.S. counties don't see a single murder. While the national homicide rate for 2019 was approximately 5 per 100,000, the rate for the 10 most dangerous community areas in the city of Chicago that year was more than 60 per 100,000. In West Garfield Park, it was a staggering 131 per 100,000. In my home city of New York, around 5% of street segments see about 50% of all crime, and about 4% of street segments see 50% of all violent crime. This trend is referred to in the criminological literature as the law of crime concentration and has been observed in cities around the world. Demographically, in New York, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims are either Black or Hispanic every single year, for which we have data going back to at least 2008. They do not make up anywhere near 95% of the population. In Chicago, a recent study of gun violence by the University of Chicago Crime Lab found that Blacks constituted 80% of homicide victims, despite constituting just 29% of the city's population. And when homicide spiked in 2020, the share of white homicide victims actually declined, while the share of Black and Hispanic victims increased. Now, as concentrated as crime is, the perpetration of serious crime is even more concentrated. Studies show that around 1% of the population can commit as much as 60% of the violent crime. Now, we live in a world with limited resources, and as such, governments must be strategic when deciding whether, and if so, how much of its resources to dedicate to particular problems. What I'd like to suggest to this committee is that the problem of violent crime, concentrated as it is in low-income minority communities in and around the United States, should be near the top of that list of problems that the U.S. Department of Justice should seek to help control. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Cohen?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I appreciate being asked to participate in this important conversation. I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of State Election Directors. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership association for the state and territorial officials whose primary responsibility is the administration of elections. Our members are in all 50 states, D.C., and the 5 U.S. territories. In the 40 states where a Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor is the chief election official, NASED's member works for the chief election official, and in the other 10 states, D.C., and 5 territories, NASED's member is the chief election official. No NASED members are elected. Our members are public servants who oversee the implementation of election systems, laws, and policies, and work with local election officials. NASED does not issue best practices or guidance, and we do not take positions on federal or state legislation or on federal or state election policy. In my written testimony, I cover NASED members' experiences with threats in the DOJ task force since its creation in June 2021. I'll focus now on our experience with the Byrne Justice Assistance Grant Program announced in January 2022. NASED does not have a position on federal funding for election administration, but when discussing the challenges facing election officials, we have to talk about funding. We've heard from many of our members that their already stretched budgets cannot accommodate the significant physical threats to both personnel and election materials. Presumably, this is more acute at the local level. Neither NASED nor most of our members were familiar with the Byrne JAG program before the announcement earlier this year. Funding for each state and territory is determined by a set formula, and there's a different formula for local jurisdictions. The fiscal 21 funding was not awarded to the states and territories until the end of September 21. Once each state or territory receives funds, each of them determines how that funding will be allocated within their jurisdiction within the bounds of the program. Relevant in-state stakeholder groups must go through a state-specific application process and address state-specific priorities. Some prefer to use these funds for tangible goods, while others prefer using them on staff costs, such as overtime for law enforcement. For 56 states and territories, there are 56 different approaches to distributing these funds to stakeholders, who can include law enforcement, drug treatment programs, and criminal diversion programs, and forensic labs, among many others. What's common across all 56 is that these applications are only open for a limited time. By the time DOJ announced on January 26th that election officials were eligible for the Byrne JAG program, and by the time election officials were briefed on the specifics of the program by grant administrators on February 8th, many application windows were closing or already closed. There was not enough time to build the necessary relationships and complete applications. The promised funding earmarked for physical security was not actually available to us. Some election officials will also struggle to access the fiscal 22 funds because of the timing and demands of the election calendar. To add insult to injury, the grant administrators clarified that election officials have always been eligible to access the Byrne JAG funding. That is, the guidance issued to the state administering agencies by DOJ in January did not add election officials to the stakeholder list. It clarified that election officials have always been stakeholders. This was news to us. The federal grant program that election officials are the most familiar with is the Help America Vote Act funding. For those grants, election officials provide a high-level budget during their application process, but have the flexibility to modify the budget and direct funds within the bounds of the law and guidance issued by the Election Assistance Commission. This allows election offices to use those funds to address emerging issues that may not have been contemplated during the application process. The Byrne JAG program offers no such flexibility to election offices. The only approved usage for funds is the usage described in the funding application. If you asked most election offices in December 2019 whether they would want a law enforcement presence at their office in November 2020, or if they were concerned about doxing, the answer would have been utter confusion. We're always fighting the ghosts of the last election, so it's nearly impossible to predict where overtime might be necessary or where other physical security-related needs may arise. A few states have had success securing reverted funds from the fiscal 21 Byrne JAG funding or promises for reverted funding from the fiscal 21 grant. This is a positive development, but hoping other stakeholders return money is not a predictable or sustainable way to fund serious security efforts. In general, while NASED appreciates the focus on election officials' work and the threats faced by our community, the result of the increased attention has been an unfocused response with limited practical improvement. NASED members and their staffs are proud to help Americans cast their ballots, but working in election administration over the last few years has been challenging. I've often said that when a person takes a job with law enforcement, even if they're not a field agent, they know that at some time they could be called upon to put their life on the line in the course of their duties. Those people make a choice to go into a line of work that could cost them their lives. Election officials did not make that choice. Until recently, this was not a field you went into thinking it could cost you your life, and now that it is, we need a whole-of-government response to ensure the safety of our community.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member.
Would you make sure your microphone is on? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, for the opportunity to testify before this committee today. My name is Jason Johnson. I'm the president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund and served as a law enforcement officer for more than 2 decades, including as Deputy Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department. There is a deadly issue facing the country, an epidemic of violent crime. Last year, there were 23,000 murders, 87% by firearms. This alarming increase in violence is not due to an epidemic of gun trafficking nor a proliferation of illegal firearms. While those must be addressed, the vast majority of the violent crimes involving firearms are by persons illegally possessing an otherwise legal gun. It is the who, not the what, that is at the root of this epidemic. Gun offenders are the most likely to reoffend and especially more likely to commit violence. Between 2016 and 2018, half of Baltimore's homicide suspects had been previously arrested for a violent crime and 43% for a gun crime. 1/3 were on parole and probation at the time of the killing. While police make such criminals a priority, they aren't getting much jail time. In Baltimore in 2016, a quarter of gun cases charged were later dropped. Those who were convicted received an average of 15% of the sentence they may have received. These justice system failures have deadly consequences. On Memorial Day 2016, a repeat violent offender named David Warren opened fire on a crowded holiday cookout, injuring 5 people. Warren had separate attempted murder charges dropped in 2010 and in 2012, and was later convicted of armed robbery, but only received 10 months of incarceration. In 2015, Warren was caught illegally carrying a gun and dealing drugs. He should have been sent away for decades, but the charges were again dropped, and he was free to commit a mass shooting. This June, Wicomico County, Maryland Sheriff's Deputy Glenn Hilliard attempted to apprehend a fugitive, Austin Davidson, who allegedly shot and killed Deputy Hilliard. Davidson was convicted of armed robbery in 2019, but received a 3-year suspended sentence. He should not have been free to murder Deputy Hilliard. The weapon crimes alone would have netted each offender decades in prison if federal prosecutors had intervened and taken those criminals off the streets. The federal government should build upon proven and effective crime-fighting strategies that give law enforcement purpose and show real results in tackling violence. Project Safe Neighborhoods, which provides grant funding and collaboration between federal prosecutors and state and local law enforcement to tackle violent crime, needs to be laser-focused on apprehending and prosecuting high-priority violent and firearm offenders. It's also vitally important to restore the morale of our law enforcement professionals. Anti-police sentiment and policies have demoralized, debilitated, and in some cases defunded law enforcement on a scale never before seen. Nearly every survey of law enforcement officers evinces a morale crisis, which has been the greatest in areas where leaders have signaled antagonism toward law enforcement. Where defund the police has become the official policy, the police exodus has reached crisis levels, with more than 1 out of 10 officer positions currently vacant in Austin, Portland, Seattle, and Minneapolis. This is amplified by progressive prosecutors such as Baltimore's Marilyn Mosby, who prefer to prosecute police officers than criminals in many cases. Voters rejected her approach when she was defeated in last month's primary election. Now many police are fleeing the profession. Our result found a 14% increase in retirements from June 2020 to April 2021, a 24% increase in resignations across 10 major police departments. Efforts to defund and debilitate the police have demoralized them. Law enforcement activity plummeted amid growing anti-police sentiment, just as homicide was spiking. Cities that cut police budgets often saw the greatest declines in active policing and largest increase in murder. To stem the tide of violence, Congress must show law enforcement they have their back. Greater penalties for those who assault and kill law enforcement, more resources for crime fighting, and aid in recruiting, training, and retaining quality police officers are key to winning the battle against violent crime. Policing is a noble profession with a vital mission. America needs to empower and support its law enforcement if we hope to tackle this wave of violence and restore public safety and trust. Thank you.
Mr. Crane?
Good afternoon, Chairman Durbin.
Good afternoon.
Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to participate in this important conversation. My name is Matt Crane, and I am the Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association. I have worked in election administration for 22 years in Colorado, including serving 5 years as the elected clerk and recorder in Arapahoe County. I also work on election integrity issues nationally. I've made the safe and accurate administration of our most sacred right to vote my life's work. I'm also a conservative Republican. The Colorado County Clerks Association consists of 64 county clerks, including Democratic, Republican, and unaffiliated officials. Our counties range in size from 450,000 active voters to 700. Our aim as an association is to focus on the education and professional development of our members and to advance mutually agreed upon policy goals, such as accessible and secure elections. I want to begin by saying the topic that we are discussing here today is not new in our nation's history. Far too often, when a candidate loses an election, the candidate and their supporters cry foul and question the system with no actual proof of anything nefarious. However, in my 22 years of work on elections, I've never seen anything that comes close to the reckless claims that have happened on this scale and in the well-funded and coordinated way it's happening today. In our current reality, it seems facts no longer matter, regardless of how much accurate information is presented. And now, political bad actors have seen the financial and political value of spreading mis and disinformation. That makes the dissemination and amplification of that fraudulent information, it means it's only growing. One of the outcomes of this unprecedented attack on our election system is that it's radicalizing people in a way that we haven't seen before. The deeply held belief among some that our elections are not secure nor accurate has manifested itself as harassment, doxing, and outright threats on the lives of some of our election administrators. And as Secretary Benson and Secretary Oliver said, this includes threats against spouses and children as well. In a survey I conducted among our 64 county clerks in late 2021, about a quarter of them reported fortifying their offices in some way, whether that was with the addition of tinted bulletproof glass, more security around office access doors, or other enhancements. Many of these clerks received inputs about what to do from their county sheriff, who was also investigating threats against them. More clerks in my state would also want to make further security enhancements, but lack the financial resources to do so. These emerging and pervasive threats to election workers and the clerks that oversee the work these emerging and pervasive threats to election workers and the clerks that oversee that work are falling the heaviest on Republican clerks right now. Many, if not all of them, have seen an uptick in everything from concerning emails to actual physical threats. In one publicized case, we've even seen a county clerk taken in by the lies. In this case, currently under state indictment and ongoing federal investigation, Clerk Tina Peters of Mesa County violated her oath of office and provided internal images of her voting system to an unknown number of outside entities. Contrary to the narrative of some, this security breach has only increased the threat to our election systems, and it's dramatically decreased the integrity of our elections. This breach has also led to an increase in the intimidation, harassment, and threats to other election officials in Colorado who, unlike the Mesa clerk, refuse to violate the public trust in the law. As we think about what we can do to keep our election workers safe, it's vitally important that we remember that a typical county clerk's office exists solely to serve the public, and they do a lot more than elections: deed recording, driver's licensing activities, voter registration. All of these activities require direct contact with the public at open counters. While clerks are doing all they can to ensure their staff stay safe, we cannot change the nature of the work they do for their communities. In Colorado, we've committed ourselves to maintaining an open, transparent operation of our elections as well. Colorado has long been considered one of the best examples of secure voting in the country. We pride ourselves in having found the right balance between access so that all can exercise their right to vote and security so that all can trust in the outcomes of these elections. But even in our exceptional state, developed over decades by state and local election officials from both political parties, we are feeling the impacts of the insistence on conspiracy over facts. This leads to two things I have to ask of you today. The first request is that you take the federal funding that is currently available and make it easier for a local election official to learn about and easier for them to receive. The current system is not transparent about where funds are available, nor are the funds easy to apply for. These grants should be allocated directly to local government officials. Passing the funds through the states creates additional delays for counties to access these funds. It may also allow states to reallocate funds from local jurisdictions. In Colorado, CISA regional staff have done an amazing job working with counties to conduct physical security assessments of our facilities. These assessments analyze facilities to help security vulnerabilities and provide recommendations regarding how to mitigate those vulnerabilities. These assessments are invaluable in helping election officials better understand the security risks they face. However, most clerks in my state have a report they can never hope to implement because they lack the resources to pay for recommended mitigations, as well as resources to be constantly chasing and securing grants. The second request I have, and perhaps the most important, we are here today because of a lie. And quite frankly, we're here today because of an absence of leadership from elected officials at the federal level and at the state level to step up and tell the truth and support election officials. I urge you to stand with us and tell the truth and support what we do. This support can be shown in many ways. Take a tour of your election facility in your state. Call your local election official if you have a concern. Avoid amplifying unproven or false rhetoric. Our constitutional republic must rely on an election process free of politics. True freedom and liberty comes from self-determination. A person's vote is a key pillar of that. When people lie about our election processes, it negatively impacts voter participation, as we saw in the 2021 Georgia Senate runoff elections. This betrays our ideals of self-determination and an active and engaged citizenry. Americans throughout our history have fought and died for our sacred right to vote. We dishonor their memory when we allow politics and disinformation to undermine this process. If we don't make a commitment to stop fanning the flames of conspiracy for political gain, it will have implications that reach much further than the next election cycle and much further than we can possibly imagine. And to be clear, this issue does not just belong to one political party. We have seen candidates from both major political parties refuse to accept defeat, and that harms our voting institutions. Again, I urge you to stand with the 8,000 plus state and local election officials across the country who are telling the truth, honoring their oaths of office, and serving their citizens by running accessible, transparent, and secure elections. I want to close by thanking you for taking the time to have this important conversation today. I believe it strikes at the very heart of the democracy we have now and will have a decade from now. The decisions we make about today and moving forward will have real implications for our nation. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Crane, and to all the panel, but Mr. Crane in particular, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here today, and thanks for what you just said. Because there might be people who watch this hearing and can't figure out what in the hell is going on here. Why won't any Republican witness or senator talk about the issue that was the subject matter of this hearing? Why won't they get into the reality of the threats that county clerks and election officials are facing across the United States? And the answer is very clear and simple and obvious, because it means saying that the big lie is a lie. It means saying that the Stop the Steal campaign has gotten out of hand. It means we've got to face the reality that there's one person who continued to inspire this violence and hatred against election officials across the United States. And they can't do it politically. They just can't do it. So they changed the subject. We have some great witnesses here who have nothing to do with the topic at hand. Mr. Hurst, thank you for coming. Thank you for your service as U.S. Attorney. Mr. Mangel, thank you for your research. And Mr. Johnson, thank you for all your work in Baltimore. Great. Violent crime has been a subject to 10 hearings. It may be the subject to 10 more. It's not the subject of this hearing. We're trying to get down to the bottom line here. What's happening to our election system? Why is Miss Benson's 6-year-old son standing in the driveway saying he's going to defend her with a stick? Because this woman's life has been threatened. Why? What crime did she commit? What did she do wrong? You participated in election machinery, administered an office for an election, and the Stop the Steal folks are out after you, right? It's changed your life, hasn't it? And that's what we wanted to talk about today. Miss Oliver, you really said it too as well. You faced it. I take a look at what happened to you. You had to go into hiding for a period of time in late 2020 after your photo, home address, and other personal information was published on a website entitled Enemies of the People. Did you ever think that's what you were signing up for when you ran for Secretary of State?
No, Mr. Chair.
No, and no one should. And I take a look, Ms. Cohen, your testimony just goes on for pages, and it's well documented. I guess it must reflect the fact that you went to Georgetown. It's well documented, and it makes a point. Harassment's been around for a long time, but not at this level. This is a new level, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Mr. Crane, that's the point we're getting to here. Thank you for what you do as a Republican county clerk in Colorado, representing that organization, I should say. And thanks to all of you for what you're doing. And the fact that my Republican colleagues don't want to talk about this is really troubling to me, because it's at the heart of our democracy. We won't have a debate about this president, next president, presidents beyond, if we don't have a trustworthy voting system, Mr. Hurst. And that's what this hearing was all about. They brought you in here for another reason, I know, though I would just want to make one point, and you made it very effectively. I'm always having to answer for violent crime in Chicago. Well, it's a terrible situation, and I've talked to the police, I've talked to everybody I can think of, I'll do all I can. But violent crime, and particularly deadly crime, has taken place in a lot of cities, large and small. The towns of Rockford and East St. Louis, my hometown of East St. Louis, has a worse crime rate than the city of Chicago. And as you mentioned, in some respects, so does Jackson, Mississippi. Most law enforcement, when it comes to criminal law, is state and local. About 90% of the enforcement is. So we can do a better job at the federal level, but everybody has to get on the same page. I'm just going to close by saying thank you all for being here. I think this hearing gets to the heart of whether we're going to have an election process we can trust in America. And for us to reach that point, members have to step up on both sides and say the big lie is a lie. Stop the steal has to stop. We've got to have a conversation at the highest levels of our government, Democrats and Republicans, about an election system we can trust. I believe we can do that, but people have to come out of the shadows and stop changing the subject. Senator Grassley.
Yeah. I'm not offended by anything you've said about the direction we've taken on our side of the aisle, or some of your other colleagues have made reference to it as well. But I've been trying to make the point that when you have, since the summer of 2020, the massive increase in crime that we've had in this country, the massive, well, in all the crime, and I've gone through those statistics, I don't have to go on again. But when people get the idea you can just break any law, some of that's obviously going to carry over into how people treat other people, whether it's election officials or anybody else. And I know you don't accept that argument, but that's the point that I'm trying to make. Mr. Hurst, when you were U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of Mississippi, you had to deal with one of the highest violent crime rates in the country, particularly the city of Jackson. At the same time, you were with Project Safe Neighborhood Initiative in the Department of Justice to help get many violent criminals off the streets. Now, under the present Department of Justice, the stated goal of the project is, quote, not to increase the number of arrests or prosecutions. Again, to emphasize the points I'm trying to make, if you're going to just tell people you aren't going to arrest them for certain crimes, this just enhances everybody's freedom. I can get away with anything. How did cooperation through dedicated initiatives help to address violent crime in Mississippi?
Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley. I almost gave you a promotion to chairman there, sorry. Ranking Member, when the Department of Justice leads initiatives. It matters. Specifically with Project Eject under the Project Save Neighborhoods banner, when we started running that program, we started hearing recordings in jail of inmates saying, the feds are in town. The feds are enforcing the law. It's a whole different ball game, is what the criminals were saying when the federal government and federal law enforcement got involved. With Project Eject, we not only had ATF participating, as General Polite said earlier, we had FBI, we had DEA, we had local and state, we had everyone at the table. So when DOJ steps up, when DOJ leads, when DOJ makes it a priority to really go after and take violent crime head on, what we see is a reduction in violent crime. Criminals respond to accountability. Criminals respond to consequences. And right now, we're not seeing a lot of consequences.
Mr. Mangiol, research indicates that the large percentage of violent crime is committed by a few repeat offenders, and so if you target them, you might substantially reduce crime rate. What does this mean for law enforcement? How might federal agencies use this knowledge to address violent crime? And if you get violent crime down, maybe we'll have less crime against election officials.
Thank you, Senator. Well, what it means for law enforcement is that if the federal government can bring more resources to bear, it can help local agencies with the use of big data to identify who the highest risks are in their communities. There is research, for example, from the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, which found that in Oakland, just 0.1% of the population was responsible for the majority of the city's homicides. When you can identify who those people are and bring serious cases against them and make those cases and take them off the street, particularly through federal prosecution, you can get seriously large incapacitation benefits that then spare the community of the offenses that those individuals would have otherwise committed. Research shows that when precision policing is engaged in, it can produce very, very large gains in the form of violent crime reductions.
Mr. Johnson, what difference would it make for Baltimore specifically to target repeat offenders and keep them locked up?
Well, Senator, we understand, and you said yourself, that the majority of violent crime is committed by a relatively small number of people. So if we can bring to bear technology and technical assistance resources of the federal government to identify who those individuals are, bring manpower resources to actually apprehend those people, and then seek accountability through the federal courts, we can effectively remove them from the street, incapacitate them so that they're not committing any more acts of violence. In state court, as of now, in cities like Baltimore, criminal defendants, violent criminal defendants, and individuals illegally carrying firearms many of their cases are being dropped, and still others, or even in those that are convicted, are serving small fractions of their sentence.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman. Those of you who have election integrity responsibilities in your testimony that I related to Mr. Polite have made the case that there is a link between the large and fraudulent scheme to spread lies about the election and the threats and harassment that you and your colleagues have experienced. And I think that's a very important point that you made. I want to highlight it, and I want to thank you for it. I also want to flag that this appears to be happening not just at random. There seems to be organizational support for this. And I'll bring up a group called the Conservative Partnership Institute that has been described as a dark money MAGA hub and a full-service shop for pro-Trump Republicans. And this group is part of a network of, at this point, it's been determined 11 other groups that all are highly closely associated with one another, sharing addresses, sharing staff, on each other's incorporation papers. And also it involves a lot of the refugees from the Trump election insurrection effort. So you have Jeffrey Clark at one of these groups, the, hard for me to see it and the camera as well, the Center for Preserving America. And as we all know, his role was bad enough that the FBI did a raid at his home to seize his electronics. Kash Patel was at the Department of Defense, and we just know that on its way out, the Trump Defense Department wiped the phones of individuals who might have been texting about the January 6th insurrection effort. You've got Mark Meadows, who participated in the pressuring of Georgia officials and has now ceased cooperation with the January 6th panel. You've got Stephen Miller, who likely wrote President Trump's speech January 6th, inciting the mob to go to the Capitol and attack their nation's capital. And you have the lawyer Cleta Mitchell, who was on the phone with Trump for the Georgia call to the Secretary of State, where Trump pressured the Georgia Secretary of State to go out and find the right number of votes to flip the election. And the likely coordination of that effort with Jeffrey Clark's effort out of the Department of Justice is pretty obvious. So this is not happening in a vacuum. In fact, it's not even happening. It's being done. And the sooner we can draw attention to those who are doing it and why it's being done, the better. In essence, this is a giant pea and shell game with a dozen shells that can be pushed out to engage with the media or to engage politically, but all, it would appear, commonly controlled, all with funders who are kept secret, and all with murky relationships with one another and with the efforts to lead an insurrection against the popular vote in the last election. And where it comes to bear in this hearing is particularly with respect to Cleta Mitchell and her election integrity network. Because if what we are seeing is a deliberate strategy of fraudulent lying designed to whip up earnest and sincere popular antagonism. And by the way, if you're an American and you think that your American democracy has been stolen from you, that is something to get mad about. So if that's the lie that you're propagating, you've got a vulnerable population of people who don't want to believe that that happened and who would be angry if you can convince them that that happened. And then you turn them loose on the election officials. And guess what? If you can drive election officials out of their jobs, if you can drive election volunteers away from the polls, you then have vacancies. Vacancies that Cleta Mitchell is training to fill right now to pursue the interference with American elections that the January 6th riot kicked off. There is nothing about this, Mr. Chairman, that is random. And I hope that there will be investigations that are done, either civilly or otherwise, to connect these obvious dots, that there is a fraudulent lie, that it is deliberately propagated, that the propagation of that lie is intended to cause harassment and threats to election officials, which in turn is designed to cause vacancies in the legitimate election official ranks that can then be filled with never election denier cohorts. And I see a lot of heads nodding as I've been going through this. I apologize not to be able to ask a question given the shortness of time, but we have a thing in the Senate Judiciary Committee called a question for the record. So I invite the officials who have knowledge of this to respond to this in whatever way you please, and we can make your answers to that question for the record a part of the proceedings. If I may ask that, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection. And thank you, Senator Whitehouse, and now Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've listened to my Republican colleagues question the first panel, and yes, they are attempting to minimize the very real attacks on the integrity of our elections and the threats and harassment of election workers, causing, I would say, probably thousands of them to say, forget it, I am not volunteering. Basically, that's what it is, volunteering to be an election worker and be exposed to these kinds of attacks. So basically, the MAGA Republicans have weaponized the position of election workers by supporting, to the extent these officials are elected, by supporting election officials who believe in the big lie and other conspiracy theories. And let us not forget that it is a big lie that led to a violent insurrection on January 6th, which, by the way, did not just happen spontaneously. We can see by the work of the House January 6th committee that the planning for this insurrection have been going on for quite a while. And so we have the violent insurrection of January 6th with a big lie and the former president impelling them. And then we have the dozens of voter suppression bills, laws that have been enacted by Republican legislatures all across the country. And the fact that Congress has not been able to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act or do other things that will actually protect the integrity of our elections. And we have a Supreme Court. Let's not forget our Supreme Court that has made it even tougher to enable the Department of Justice to prosecute some of these more obvious voter suppression laws under what is left of the Voting Rights Act, because this Supreme Court has basically created even more ways that these kinds of voter suppression laws can be held constitutional. So we are in an environment where, yes, our democracy is at stake. And here we are focusing on election integrity, and we're listening to our colleagues talk about how important it is to go after violent crime. Yes, it is, yeah. And how about going after the massive gun violence in our country? How about focusing on some of that, but we're not. But in the meantime, I want to thank all of you who have testified today who are election workers, secretaries of New Mexico and Michigan. When I was the lieutenant governor of the state of Hawaii, we did not have a secretary of state. The lieutenant governor was the elections person. And one of the first things I did, because the lieutenant governor is in an elected position, and I believe the election should be run in a totally nonpartisan way, one of the first things I did as lieutenant governor to eliminate the election functions from the office of lieutenant governor, and we created an office of elections. After every election prior to this action being taken by the state legislature in removing the election function from, at that point, my office, after every election, the lieutenant governor would be sued. And these suits never got anywhere, but because it was done by an elected person, then there are always those who thought that the outcomes could be challenged as somehow being tainted by political considerations. So I commend all of you for putting yourself forward. And in fact, I'd like to ask the Secretary Benson, why did you decide to become Secretary of State in as Michigan's chief election officer with everything that's going on around elections?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I'm here today wearing a bracelet of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I wear it with me all the time to remind me of the sacrifices made so that we could live in a democracy where the one person, one vote promise in our Constitution is a reality for everyone. I started my career in Alabama working to investigate hate groups and hate crimes throughout the country and came to the conclusion that the only way we could ensure that every voice was heard in our country is to have a democracy that is led by people who are dedicated to making that promise true for everyone. State secretaries of state live that every day. We serve as guardians of the democratic process. Whether we be Democrat, Republican, or independent, we make decisions daily that are geared towards increasing the security of our process and the accessibility of it. So that's why I wanted this job, and you'll find that my story is not that different from my colleague in New Mexico, who similarly was an election administrator who simply wanted to do her job to make sure elections are safe and secure for all, and the tens of thousands of election workers around the country can share that story. And so I'm proud to stand among these individuals, many of whom on the local level face threats without security details and other protections, but they are the true heroes of our democracy.
Thank you. And I also commend the Secretary of the Elections New Mexico. Thank you. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Rono. Senator Klobuchar.
Let Senator Padilla, who's been gallantly going back and forth between our two hearings, he can go first. I'll go next.
Senator Padilla.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Catch your breath. This was in some ways a continuation of the Rules Committee hearing happening today as well. For 6 years, as this committee has heard me say time and again, I had the honor of serving as California's Secretary of State. And at that time, we were able to drive the success of 3 elections, including in 2020, when we ensured that more Californians participated in the electoral process than they ever had before. Record registration, record turnout, smooth, safe, accessible election. Now, that work would not have been possible without the extraordinary efforts of not just state elections, professionals, and volunteers, but so many at the local level as well. Successful elections only happen because of the dedicated, hardworking, patriotic staff that are willing to go above and beyond to ensure that Americans could participate in the political process. But as the testimony here today has so credibly highlighted, our election workers now face extraordinary threats and harassment just for doing the most basic, essential work of our democracy, helping people cast their ballot. I'm grateful that they continue to show up for work despite these additional hardships, but I'm also extremely concerned that unless we address this problem head on, not ignore it, not sweep it under the rug, unless we address it head on, fewer and fewer people will choose to serve as election workers. So my first question is for the 2 secretaries of state, my former colleagues, Secretary Benson and Secretary Oliver. Can you expand on how the ordinary work of our election workers is so extraordinarily important to our democratic process, and how the recent rise in threats is affecting recruitment and retention of workers?
Thank you, Senator Padilla, my former colleague and friend. Appreciate the question. I don't think folks realize how much goes into planning and executing an election, and how many individuals. What I like to emphasize is the fact that we have a citizen-run democracy in the United States. And although this is my profession and my colleagues' profession, the people on the ground on Election Day, during early voting, checking off and processing absentee ballots, those are volunteers. Those are individuals. Those are friends and family of both political parties, of all political parties and no political party, from around our communities and in our communities. These are the individuals who come back year after year, who believe it's their civic duty. Without them, we simply do not have a democracy, and we won't have a democratic process. And to the points that have been made here today so eloquently by my colleagues, we are on the verge of not having that process anymore, because we are not going to have enough committed citizen individuals if these threats and the big lie that is driving them continues.
And I'll just add to that, the other side of this, in Michigan, we just held a primary election yesterday, and I went around and thanked election workers throughout the day. And what I actually saw was another piece of the story, which is at the same time, while these threats are real and the loss of so much institutional history is real, we're also seeing a number of individuals, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, well-intentioned citizens standing up to say, I want to serve. We're seeing individuals, in fact, 6,000 individuals in Michigan signed up to serve as new election workers in yesterday's election. And so I have a lot of hope, actually, that through this moment, if citizens observe these challenges and simply seek out the truth and step up with us to serve and protect our democracy, we can actually emerge from this moment with a stronger, healthier, more robust democracy than ever before. But that ultimately will be determined by the citizens of our country itself, who will determine whether to stand with us in this moment in furtherance of the truth in our democracy or not.
And to be abundantly clear, is the problem that I laid out a danger, a threat? Does it hurt Democratic voters, Republican voters, all voters?
In fact, Senator, the recent situation in Otero County, New Mexico, not only did the big lie push the county commission in that county so far as to actually take an initial vote to not certify the election process, it would have disenfranchised 7,300 voters in that county, the vast majority of whom are Republicans. All of the candidates, with maybe 2 exceptions on the ballot, that would have been disqualified from the general election would have been Republican candidates. So we're fighting to save the vote for every voter, regardless of party.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, I want to have one more question that ties the discussion happening in Rules Committee and the need to reform the Electoral Count Act to this topic here in Judiciary Committee. In discussing the increasing threats that election workers face simply for doing their jobs, I think it's important that we understand why we're facing these threats in the first place. Because to this day, nearly 2 full years after the November 2020 election, people who should know better continue to spread lies and disinformation about the election. They continue to claim, without any shred of evidence, that there was massive fraud and irregularities in the ballot counts. There wasn't. They continue to refuse to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. He did. So these lies aren't just innocuous political rhetoric. They're dangerous statements that have the effect of riling people up, undermining faith in our democracy, and putting real people, from election workers to candidates for office, in harm's way. And I'm not even talking about the deadly insurrection that took place here in the nation's capital. So my final question, Secretary Benson, I think you are perfect to respond here. Can you walk the committee through the link between the big lie and the increase in election threats that we've seen since the 2020 election?
Yes, I think we have to recognize that while we've talked a lot today about challenges, threats facing public officials generally, there's a particular nuance here. It's critically important that those attacking us are motivated by lies and misinformation that they have been told by people they trust. In fact, I mean, there are members of the U.S. Senate, some of whom are on this committee, who knowingly spread falsehoods about the security of our elections with zero evidence, factual basis. And, today I hope they hear me when I say that in doing so, they are hurting us. They are hurting our democracy. We are professional election administrators. We work every day to ensure that every voter, regardless of where they live or who they vote for, can participate in choosing their leaders and holding them accountable. And when many of those leaders then turn around and spread or amplify conspiracy theories about the security or accuracy of our elections that have been proven false by multiple sources, they then put our lives in danger. They put the lives of our kids and our loved ones in danger. So I hope that members of this body and others hear that from us today, and they put an end to it, because that is what is going to happen in order for ultimately these threats to stop.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Benson, we've worked together. I appreciate you coming before the Rules Committee, and I think we've done some really important work there and are about to do some very important work on the Electoral Count Act. That hearing couldn't have gone better, just so you all know, while you were testifying here, that was going over there, and it was very bipartisan, and we're a very positive hearing with every single witness agreeing, including the Republican witnesses, that we should reform the act and basically on the structure of those reforms. So I'll start with you, Secretary Benson. In December of 2020, approximately 24 armed protesters accused you of ignoring voter fraud in the 2020 election. They surrounded your house chanting, "Stop the steal," as you prepared, as I understand, to watch a Christmas movie with your 4-year-old son. In one video updated to social media, at least one person could be heard shouting your murderers within earshot of your child's bedroom. Could you describe the toll that those kinds of intimidation tactics have taken on you and your family?
Yes, thank you, Senator Klobuchar, also really for your leadership of bringing people together to move things forward. And I hope we'll see more bipartisan leadership as well on many of the other things we need to do to improve and protect our democracy. So I'm grateful for your leadership on that. I signed up for this work knowing that oftentimes defending democracy means being able to and willing to stand on the front lines and face down threats and challenges. Indeed, that's what many heroes throughout the history of our country have done. We certainly, though, don't expect them in the dark of night to come to the doorstep of our homes. I certainly didn't expect as a mom to have to explain to my kid what the noise was, and even again, that was a very well-known incident. It was not the only incident outside my home, and to have to teach my son that standing up for what's right often does require us to handle threats like these, threats to our lives. It creates an air of anxiety and stress that no child and no parent should have to endure. And to know that this is happening because of a lie, because of lies about our democracy, makes it particularly pernicious and painful. But again, the last thing I'll say is that evening, for me, I also knew they weren't protesting me. Those individuals were protesting the will of the people in our state. And as the Secretary of State of Michigan, I'll proudly defend the will of the people every day and stand up to do it again and again. So thank you again.
Thank you. Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, good to see you again, and thank you for I know you were served a term also as the heads of the Secretaries of State nationally, got to work with my great Secretary of State, Steve Simon. I won't mention our voter turnout rate is the highest in the country, but I just did. And I want to thank you. Following the 2020 election, your personal information was published. You had to leave your home under police protection for weeks. In the years since, you and other members of your office have had to use services to remove personal information from the internet, and as recently as this past June, you received threatening phone calls that had to be referred to the FBI. We know election workers like yourself and like the people that work for you in every state in this country are necessary to the functioning of our democracy. It's never acceptable for anyone to use violence or threats of violence to advance political goals. Could you talk about how these threats have made it harder for not just you, but your staff to do their jobs?
Yes, and thank you, Senator. Thanks for always being such a wonderful partner and advocate and working with election officials across the board. I had not the same situation as Secretary Benson, but like Secretary Benson, this has had a deeper and profound impact on me and my personal life and on my staff. And I think it's the staff, I think it's the state election officials, and then, of course, the folks that are really on the front lines, our county clerks, our local election administrators and their family and their staff, those poll workers that are out in the field that literally just come in to do their jobs, leave their partisan hat at the door, that are being most deeply affected. I was just at our state county clerk meeting prior to our general election that we do. We do it before every statewide election in New Mexico, having very important moving conversations, primarily actually this time with county clerks from across party lines to me that are experiencing the impacts most deeply in their counties, that are wondering if they can keep going on, that are talking about retirement, that are wondering if they're going to run for re-election because the daily pressure and stress and serious concern that they're dealing with is making them wonder if they can continue. And so, I know that's just a microcosm of the macrocosm of what we are experiencing as election officials at all levels.
Thank you. Mr. Crane, I missed your statement because I was doing this other hearing, but my staff told me you did a great job. And I thought this question, just kind of playing off what the Secretary of State talked about of turnover, this came out in a hearing we had, including from the Kentucky Secretary of State, Republican Secretary of State, just about how it was hard to retain volunteers and staff, and how perhaps federal law, and Senator Durbin and I have talked about, could address these threats and could help in terms of recruiting and retaining workers if they knew that their safety was protected. If you want to elaborate.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. It has been a big concern, as my colleagues here have said. It's interesting, you know, we hear and we talk about as officials, you know, we signed up for this. We know Secretary Benson so eloquently talked about that. Election judges, though, Secretary Oliver said this, they are the ones. It's our church members. It's our Elks Lodge members. It's the PTA. These are the people that are actually conducting the elections. And we have seen an increase in threats and intimidation to election workers, too, where we are seeing our counties in Colorado where people are trying to get the information, the names and addresses and telephone numbers of these citizen election workers so that they can put pressure on them, intimidate them. And it has had a chilling effect on their willingness to participate. However, like Secretary Benson now, I think we see people getting their second wind, finding resolve, and saying, we're not going to let this get to us. We're going to stand in the breach, and we're going to do this, and we're going to defend democracy. And I think we're starting to see more and more in that. And that's why, during my comments earlier, we're here in large part because of failure of leadership. If people would just stand up and tell the truth on both sides of the aisle, we'd be much better off. And when we can look around and see that we're all together in this, I think the way that we can move forward together and continue to run successful elections and elections that our citizens can be proud of and have confidence in. But we need people to step up and lead. And if they don't want to lead, then get behind us. We'll lead, because that's what we've been doing for 2 years.
Well, I really appreciate those remarks, just because I think it's very important for Republicans to stand up in addition to Democrats. And you're doing that today, and we've seen that in the January 6 hearings over in the House. And we've seen people, Democrats and Republicans, talk about what's happened to them. I was just thinking about those poll workers in Georgia, the mother and daughter pair, where the mom, Miss Ruby, was always so proud to wear the T-shirt that said Lady Ruby, and she couldn't even wear it anymore because she'd been singled out by the President of the United States. And those stories are heartfelt. Al Schmidt, the former Republican election commissioner in Philadelphia, who's not in his job now, but 3 kids, he had to move out of his house. And having both sides come and speak out, that's what's going to make the difference. And I liked what you said. So thank you, all of you. We look forward to working with you. I see Mr. Chair Norm Eisen's there, who just did a great job testifying before the Rules Committee. We can do 2 things at once. And he came by to see you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar, and thanks for your work in the Rules Committee, which is parallel to this conversation, which we've had for 3 hours today. This is the first hearing we've ever had in this committee on threats against election workers. I'm sorry we had to have it. I wish it had been more bipartisan, but I appreciate those members who did attend and participate in it. We've got to solve this problem together. I don't know who the winner will be in the next election. Nobody does. It really is up to the American people. It's up to us to create a process that's credible so that the result, when it's announced, is accepted. That's the only way a democracy can prevail. There are some who did not accept the 2020 result, and we're paying a heavy price for it. Mr. Crane, going back to your point, both parties have to come together to make sure that in the future we do have a credible outcome and stand by it if we want to preserve this democracy, and that's our first obligation. So thank you all for your testimony. There may be a question for the record sent to you. If you receive one, please respond to it as quickly as possible so we can complete the record. But thanks for your patience today.